Introduction and for the invitation. I just wanted to acknowledge the conference organizers for having just the vision to include number one, para-sport or Paralympic sport, and number two, safeguarding in the Congress program. It's really an honor to be here and share from those two spaces. Let's see. So, I often find that for those who are not directly involved in Paralympic sport, it can be a little bit of an enigma. So for the first part of this presentation, if you'll allow me, I'm going to provide some context, just to make sure we're all on the same page. So to start, I'll describe the contemporary Paralympic movement. Thereafter, I'll describe some injuries in para-athlete, whether they are unintentional or intentional. And finally, I'll wrap up by describing some of the ongoing knowledge gaps in our data when it comes to injury, and therefore, in our capacity to be prepared for injury prevention. So starting with the contemporary Paralympic movement. So as you know, language and culture are completely interdependent, right? One is a reflection of the other, and they often reflect society's evolving beliefs regarding a certain topic. Now, the language used to describe sport for persons with a cognitive or a physical disability has evolved really dramatically over the past 10 to 20 years. So terms like disabled sport, I'm sure you'll agree with me, have all but disappeared from the popular and scientific literature, whereas adapted sport and terms like that have taken their place. In 2016, the IPC put forth the term para, so that's capital P space no hyphen, in order to describe sports for persons who have an impairment, whether it's cognitive or physical. And it's critical because there is a meaningful difference between the term adapted and para. How's that? Well, an adapted sport is a sport that's been evolved or adapted from its original able-bodied equivalent. So wheelchair basketball, shown in the slide, is an example of that. Whereas a para sport is an independent sport that may or may not have an able-bodied equivalent. So goalball is an example of a para-sport, also shown on the slide. So sport, as we know, we've heard, represents a really critical health strategy for people that have a disability. That's because for persons with an impairment, generally, whether they're active or not, the risk of a lifestyle-related disease, no matter what it is about 4 times increased compared to the same person with no impairment. So it's critical in this population to introduce physical activity, sport, as a health strategy, not just for mental but also physical health. Now, the benefits of sport are extremely well documented, and we've gone through some of those this morning. I'll just highlight 2. For persons with an impairment, improved mental health is particularly striking. Also, reduced healthcare costs, so the reduction of healthcare burden costs, whether it's the costs of having a carer or the costs of actual rehabilitation, are reduced once sport is introduced. And we'll talk a little bit about the risks of injury, intentional and unintentional, as we get further in the presentation. Now, para-rowing, obviously we're at the World Rowing Conference. I'm a track athlete, so I kind of feel like I'm a little bit of an imposter here, but and I am definitely not an endurance athlete by any means, so I'm impressed by anyone that can row. But para-rowing is one of 23 Paralympic sports. And just to set the stage for you, the eligible impairment categories are listed. So the IPC started off by describing eligible impairments by the diagnosis, so spinal cord injury, CP, etc. We've since evolved to simply describe impairment categories. So people that have a spinal cord injury may have hypertonia, for example. Those with amputation may have reduced muscle power, for example. So the diagnoses are not what you'll see here, but typically in para-rowing, you might have athletes with a spinal cord injury or an amputation and other diagnoses, but the eligible impairments are listed here. Features of the sport, well, it started in 2008 Paralympic Games. There were 4 boat classes, but at the recent 2018 International Rowing Regatta, a few more boat classes were added. Back in 2016, the distances were all 1,000 meters, which, again, I'm a long jumper, I run 30 meters, just sounds like an age to me. Now, the distances are all 2,000 meters. And in Rio, 88 athletes participated. The governing body is obviously World Rowing. So the scale of the contemporary Paralympic movement...
4,302 athletes, the 2020...
Sorry, I just wanted to introduce it. So the scale of the contemporary Paralympic movement is pretty impressive. And just to sort of describe that for you, I've got a whiteboard animation that we created to just share with you how far we've come as the Paralympic movement.
With 4,302 athletes, the 2012 London Paralympic Games ushered in a sea change in public perception and commercial appeal of parasport. Brands looked beyond disability and bought into high-performance sport with a diverse and inclusive image. London smashed ticket sale records, had a global television audience of 3.8 billion in 115 countries, and were hailed as the greatest Paralympic Games ever. Sochi 2014 and Rio 2016 continued the trend, receiving an unprecedented 116 hours of television coverage in the US. In Rio, 4,378 athletes participated, and NBC Universal increased their coverage from London by 91%. Through media, a new global community is being formed. Audiences this size don't come along every day, and they are worth their weight in gold. While its commercial success has been meteoric, developments in parasport science have not kept pace. Take the sprint start. In able-bodied athletics, scientists have invested decades calculating the optimal mechanics to produce world-leading.
Thank you. So the key there is that the commercial success of parasport has been truly meteoric, but developments in parasport science have absolutely not kept pace. And so my lab essentially tries to fill some of those injury-related research gaps. We have a variety of topics, study designs, and outcomes, but two of the studies that I'm going to just share with you today are review papers that we did. One of them chronicling the unintentional injuries, musculoskeletal and para-athletes, and the other chronicling intentional injuries, i.e. harassment and abuse among para-athletes. So unintentional injuries. This is the most recent comprehensive review of unintentional injuries in Paralympic and para-athletes, globally. So we put it out this year in 2018 in physical medicine and rehabilitation clinics of North America, starting from about 900 papers or thereabouts. After multiple exclusions, we ended up with 47 studies to include in the analysis. So there were some general trends in injury between summer and winter para-athletes. For athletes who use wheelchairs, unsurprisingly, we found that they sustain upper extremity injuries in high percentages, whereas for those who are ambulant, lower extremity injuries are sustained in high percentages. In contrast to able-bodied athletes, the upper extremity is the most commonly injured anatomic area in para-athletes. Some of the risk factors for that across all athletes, whether it's at the Paralympic level of competition or the youth level of competition, is increased age, spinally injured diagnosis, and then shoulder muscle imbalance. Injury and severity and chronicity have also been sort of trended. Chronic overuse injuries, which might include muscle contusions, skin abrasions, sunburns, decubitus ulcers, and tendinoses, are extremely common. And a lot of these are lifestyle-related, age-related, overuse injuries, whereas acute traumatic injuries, which are catastrophic, are far less common. And these might include tears, ruptures, and breaks. There are some differences in injury epidemiology based on pre-participation behavior, but not gender. So among all para-athletes, again, from youth all the way up to Paralympics, male and females have really similar overall injury rates. Whereas for those who receive mandatory periodic health evaluations, they tend to have reduced injury rates and improved performances. So this doesn't seem like a huge revelation, but a Polish scientist in parasport really put it nicely. They sort of compared behaviors before the London Games and the Rio Games. And what they determined was that when they instituted mandatory pre-participation exams of their Paralympic team, injury rates were dramatically reduced and performances improved. So it's sort of it's a very intuitive sort of scientific study to read and interpret, but it's important to note that there's data that some of these practices can prevent injuries in these groups. Injury risk does vary by sport and season. During the summer games, the highest injury incidence was in football five-a-side, which is football for visually impaired athletes. This was actually fascinating to watch at the Rio Paralympic Games. So you can imagine football players, particularly there's one player who's essentially known as the Pele of Paralympic football, running full speed following a ball that they can hear but can't see, into each other, right? So we actually, during the games, heard heads cracking. You can see persons who appear to have something like a mild traumatic brain injury, stuporous afterwards. So it's a very dangerous sport, and it's the sort of sport that we like to keep track of at the IPC because the injury incidence is so high. At the Winter Games, the highest injury incidence was in the skiers and the snowboarders. So generally speaking, probably because of the high velocity nature of some of these sports, overall injury incidence during the Winter Games is about twice as high as that during the Summer Games. So a critical concept for para sports is the concept of the weight-bearing shoulder. So in contrast to able-bodied or non-disabled athletes, seated athletes use their shoulder as a weight-bearing joint. So in those of us who are ambulant, who I think are most of us in this room, the shoulder is traditionally non-weight-bearing. It obviously has increased degrees of freedom. We can move it through multiple planes of motion, but that increased mobility comes at the cost of decreased stability, and there's a high risk of overuse injuries in the shoulder. For a person who uses their shoulder in the same way that you and I might use our hip, their risk of injury in that joint is astronomical. So not only are they using it to play and compete, particularly in overhead sports or upper extremity dominant sports like para-rowing, but they're also using it to get around every day. So athletes who are daily manual wheelchair users place their shoulders under abnormally high loads, not only, again, during playing and competing, but also during weight shifts, pressure relief lifts, transfers, propulsion, start-start maneuvers. And this has implications for injury prevention, but also for diagnostic and therapeutic decision-making. So if I had an athlete who is ambulant versus one who is seated, and they come into me with the same shoulder injury, and the options are operative or non-operative, if the recovery time is going to make that athlete who is seated not be able to use their shoulder as the weight-bearing joint for 6, 8, 12 weeks, I might lean towards a non-operative course of management to reduce the time that they're going to be unable to use their weight-bearing joint in the same way that you and I might use our hips. So somewhat surprisingly, I found there is a dearth of data related to overuse injuries in any joint, including the shoulder, among para-rowers. So I asked my lab to scan the literature and scan it again and scan it again and scan it again, and we found 2 studies, one in 2011 and one in 2018, that chronicled diaphragmatic fatigue and then a rib stress injury in one athlete from Croatia. So opportunity for everybody in this audience, you can, if there's interest, investigate musculoskeletal injury in para-rowers because it's needed. Our conclusion for our review was that an overuse rib stress injury was reported in a single Croatian athlete. Some of the authors actually thought really carefully about it, and they thought it probably had to do with complete reliance on the upper extremity, as I just mentioned, and also certain forces that are transmitted through the body in an imbalanced way because of some of that shoulder muscle imbalance. All right, now to intentional injuries. FISA and other sport organizations, as we just described in our workshop, are increasingly recognizing that safe sport, i.e., an athletic environment that is free from all forms of harassment and abuse, is critical. So obviously there's been lots of work around this area. The IOC put forth a consensus statement in 2016. The US Center for Safe Sport was established formally in 2017, and then the Safe Sport International Group had its inaugural conference in April of 2018 in Madrid, Spain. And multiple sport organizations are putting forth, including FISA, putting forth their own safeguarding policies. So a central concept that I just have to emphasize because it's really critical when we think about safeguarding policies, safeguarding programs, and the safeguarding concepts in general, is that a power differential anchors every single form of harassment and abuse in sport, whether it's physical, sexual, psychological, financial, or neglect. It's really critical for us to know that a power inequity is indeed what sets the stage on which all forms of abuse can occur. So it's no surprise then that athletes with an impairment really have particularly high risk of intentional harms. All athletes have daily training needs, daily nutritional needs, but athletes with impairment may have an additional layer of daily self-care needs that at times requires the hands-on participation of a member of that athlete's entourage, whether it's a coach or a teammate or a parent. Indeed, the data has shown that youth with impairments, whether they're athletes or not, have 2 to 3 increased risk of all forms of abuse. And again, some of that has to do with some of the blurred responsibilities among the athlete entourage, who may be helping that athlete with their daily self-care needs, in addition to the training and nutritional needs that all athletes have. Quantitative data specific to these athletes remains sparse, so what do we do? Another review. So this review is currently under review by BJSM. And this time we actually cast a much wider net. So we reviewed greater than 2,000 papers. And after multiple exclusions, we came up with a whopping number of 8 papers that have been published in the extant literature to describe physical and sexual and psychological abuse among athletes who have impairments. So here are some of the study characteristics. First, all published within the past 5 years. Second, the level of evidence generally wasn't too high. It was about level 4. The study designs, by and large, included a qualitative component, not quantitative, and then all the studies took place in developed as opposed to developing nations. The settings were primarily non-school-based recreational sports facilities, and the types of abuses studies, whether it's psychological or bullying or financial or hazing, were really mostly bullying, which we'll get to in the conclusions. And then finally, the population of athletes studied were youth and adults with a wide range of physical impairments. And so here are some of the select results. In 2016, Dr. Vertolman's team found that of 302 athletes total, disability was a predictor of both physical and sexual violence. In fact, she found that the prevalence of psychological violence was about 50% in athletes with disability, physical violence about 30%, and then sexual violence, again, about 30% in those that had a disability, compared to able-bodied. Dr. McHugh, in 2017, she surveyed 10 parents, and she found that cyberbullying was extremely common among athletes who have a disability, and it was tolerated for the sake of friendship. So her study was actually really nice because she essentially titled it Friendship at All Costs, and the concept there was that bullying was identified and tolerated for the sake of being socially included on the team. Finally, Dr. McPherson in 2017 found that among 107 respondents, more than a third described experiences of overtraining or being physically forced to train when injured. So one of the athletes reported being asked to do a handstand and then being deliberately pushed over by her coach as just part of a joke during a regular training session. So physical abuse was also included in this review. Our conclusions, however, are that bullying, right, and forms of emotional harm perpetrated against young, recreational, visually impaired athletes have received the majority of coverage, but the true depth and breadth of harms that are intentional in this population really obviously still remains unknown. So finally, I'll just touch on some of those ongoing gaps. So this table just summarizes what's known and what's not known. So we'll start with what is known. When it comes to unintentional injury, the upper extremity is the most commonly injured anatomic area in para-athletes. Chronic overuse injuries are significantly more common than acute traumatic. Among para-rowers, there have been cases of diaphragmatic fatigue and overuse rib injury, but really there's nothing been studied about the shoulder, which we'll get to in what's not known. Regular periodic health evaluations may reduce injury rates in at least elite, i.e. Paralympic para-athletes. What remains unknown, so opportunities for research here in the group. The epidemiology of shoulder injuries and other joint injuries in para-rowers is particularly for those who are non-ambulatory, remains unknown. And then the nature and effectiveness of injury prevention programs at all levels of competition remains unknown. When it comes to intentional injury, what we do know is that athletes with impairment may be up to 4 times increased risk of harassment and abuse compared to their able-bodied peers, and that bullying among young, visually impaired athletes has received really the most attention in the extant but limited literature. Finally, what remains unknown, the true breadth and depth of intentional harms in this group, risk factors for intentional harm, and then finally, the effectiveness of some of our ongoing safe sport programs and para-rowers at all levels of competition. And so if we're leaning towards injury injury prevention, evidence-based, that is truly data-driven. We don't have the data as yet, but we could start thinking about how we can implement it. And I kind of see it at two different levels, so at the level of the athlete and then at the level of federation. At the level of the athlete, pre- and rehabilitation exercises might make sense, particularly for those who use their shoulders as a weight-bearing joint. This has been proven to be really effective in wheelchair basketball. A pre-participation exam, specifically for shoulder girdle muscles, might be useful. The consideration of a pre-participation ultrasound in the shoulder, particularly in those who are high risk, older, spinally injured, with muscle imbalances, could be useful. And then finally, we have to consider demographics. The average age of a Paralympic athlete is somewhere in their mid-40s. The oldest athlete we surveyed at the Rio Paralympic Games was 75. So athletes that are Olympians versus Paralympians are a completely different demographic group. So when we think about injury prevention, we have to take that into consideration. Finally, at the level of the federation, potentially equipment recommendations might make sense. Again, we don't have the data yet to really stand on that solidly, but it's something to consider. Obviously, there's an imbalance between what we know and what we don't, but we'll get there. In summary, there are a few quotes that I think kind of bring this kind of all together. So emphasizing the fact that really there's an imbalance of what we know and what we don't know. Confucius said, true wisdom is knowing what we don't know. Emphasizing the fact that for data-driven, evidence-informed injury prevention protocols, we really need to investigate a bit more. LBJ said, doing the right thing isn't the problem, but knowing what to do is the problem. And finally, emphasizing the critical importance of safeguarding for all of us in this room and anybody involved in sport. MLK said, never be afraid to do what's right, especially if the psychological, physical, or emotional well-being of a person is at stake. Society's punishments are small compared to the wounds we inflict on our souls when we simply look the other way, particularly in the setting of intentional injury. So thanks again for your time, and to the organizers, this concludes my presentation.
So we're on time, very well done. I think we have time for one or two questions. Any questions to Jetze? Everything's clear. Well done. All right. If there are no questions, then thank you for your presentation. It was really good and I learned a lot. Thank you for that.
Yes. 2 minutes, I just go around and close the doors. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you to the next session. We had recently a nice injury prevention in Paralympic athletes, and now we're going to the heart. And rowing to the heart, we have in rowing the problem of high volume stress, and we know that rowers have big hearts, large hearts, and we always think it's beneficial to have a big heart and a great heart, but there might be limits. And this session is directed to the question, why this demands of rowing, how much they challenge the heart adaptation and to what limits. And the first of these exciting speakers is Dr. Aaron Baggish from Massachusetts General Hospital, Department of Cardiac Unit Associates in Boston and Harvard Medical School, and we are happy that he was able to come here.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. As introduced, I live and work in Boston, where I direct the Cardiovascular Performance Program, but I just want to take a minute to acknowledge my current academic home, which is the University of Lausanne in Switzerland, where I'm fortunate enough to be spending a sabbatical year, so I want to acknowledge their hospitality. It's been a wonderful few months, and I look forward to the rest of the year there with them. I've been asked to talk about the high cardiac output athlete and to discuss the role of ventricular remodeling. And this is really a talk in which we'll begin with some physiology and use physiology as a platform to understand exactly what happens to the heart of the rower, how the rower's heart adapts over time, and what this may look like throughout the course of a career and potentially into the later years of life. So by way of disclosures, these are groups I have affiliations with. Most relevant to this talk is both Harvard University and U.S. Rowing, both of whom I serve in a consulting role with and do research with. And I have a funding source list here that supports our research, just so you're aware of where this comes from. So before we talk about sports, I want to talk about heart disease, because to understand the physiology of sport, the easiest way to do so is by understanding the physiology of valvular heart disease. As most of you know from your basic anatomy, the aortic valve is the last valve that blood leaves when it sees the heart, and when the aortic valve gets diseased, it can do so in one of two ways. It can leak or it can tighten. Leaky aortic valve produces the condition called aortic regurgitation, which is a volume challenge for the heart. Volume challenge in the sick heart causes chamber dilation, and in contrast, when the heart valve gets tight, we call this aortic stenosis. The left ventricle feels pressure, and the left ventricle responds with a thickening. So how might this relate to sporting activity? Well, it actually relates quite nicely. If you broadly and oversimplistically divide sports into endurance activities and strength activities, you realize the physiology is quite different. So endurance athletes, your Nordic skiers, your rowers, your runners, your cyclists, your triathletes, they ask their bodies to generate and sustain high cardiac outputs, often 4 to 5-fold what they will be doing at rest. They do so by increasing heart rate and to some degree augmenting stroke volume, and this comes in the context of a profound vasodilation in the periphery. So big cardiac output, arteries widely dilated. In contrast, strength activity is a very, very different physiology. Here the athletes may be squatters, they may be football linemen, they may be hammer throwers, discus throwers. The physiology here is repetitive surges in systolic blood pressure, often in excess of 300 millimeters mercury. This is caused by intense skeletal muscle contraction, sympathetic activation, and a peripheral vasoconstriction. For the heart, this is a pressure challenge. So the concept that sport type may affect the heart in different ways is not a new concept. Perhaps the most historically important paper in this realm dates back to 1975, published in Annals of Internal Medicine, an American journal by Morgan Roth, Marin, Epstein, and company. And this paper looked at heart sizes in different types of athletes. They compared swimmers, runners, who were the endurance athletes, to wrestlers, who in this study were the strength athletes. And they asked the simple question, when you look cross-sectionally, do these hearts look different? And the answer is yes, that the swimmers and runners had more heart dilation than the wrestlers. This has been followed by a number of large cross-sectional studies in which athletes' cardiac dimensions have been analyzed, and athletes are ranked according to heart size. And you can see here again at the ends of the spectrum, you have rowing up at the top with big hearts, and you have weightlifting down at the bottom with less dilated, smaller hearts. So one of the challenges in terms of understanding how the heart responds to exercise is that the literature historically is subject to a study design limitation, and that is the limitation of cross-sectional studies. And to illustrate this point, I want to use the example of the American basketball player. Everyone in the room can look at American basketball players and agree on the observation that basketball players are tall. There's no question about that. Where this becomes interesting is when you offer explanation. So most of us in the room have been around sport well enough to know that by the time a young male or female gets to be about the age of 10, the tall kids in class are tall, the short kids are short, and the teacher points to the tall kids and says, you should play basketball. So we know that tall people self-select for basketball. If, on the contrary, you ask the uninformed, and I've done this experiment with my children, why basketball players are tall, they may very likely tell you that basketball makes people grow tall. So this is the problem with any cross-sectional observation, and this is historically why our understanding of how the heart responds to exercise has been quite limited. We've been left with the classic chicken and the egg question, and that is, does exercise cause heart enlargement, or do people born with big hearts simply self-select for sport? And this was a question very early on in my career I decided to wrestle with, and this has really been the platform for the last 20 years of work. As some of you may be well aware, we have an initiative in the States called the Harvard Athlete Initiative, in which we've developed a model for longitudinal repeated measure studies to really, for the first time, develop cause and effect relationship between cardiovascular adaptation and exercise. I'm going to go through a number of these with you, so what I want to do is just take a second and introduce you to the basic study design so that you can understand both its strengths and its limitations. At the university level in the States, we have athletes that are at a very precious period of plasticity. They've done enough sporting activity to be good enough to be considered athletes, but they've never been exposed to the rigors of elite level training and competition until they arrive at university. And then in the first 3 to 6 months, they undergo the most intense form of training that they have in their lives. So if plasticity, if change should occur, this is an optimal time to see it. And this is the model we use. When we identify athletes that have been recruited, say as part of the men or women's crew team, we contact them before they arrive and help them gather baseline training data for the 6 to 8 weeks before they get there. We study them on arrival. We then put them out into their training and follow them very closely. And then we study them at some repeat interval with an emphasis on any of the different things that we're curious from year to year. So what we have is the ability to characterize baseline training and acute training intensification, and then ultimately, as I'll get to, some extended training experience adaptation. So one of the very first studies we did was to go back to that very first paper I showed you, the Morgenroth paper from 1975, and see if we could prove in a causal way that exercise causes heart change. So does exercise cause the heart to get bigger? And we chose 2 athletes that represent the opposite end of the spectrum. We chose strength athletes, who were the linemen on the football team, and we chose rowers who were preparing for the head of the Charles. And we simply wanted to know, in a 90-day period of training intensification, did their hearts adapt? And indeed they did. This was quite a remarkable amount of adaptation we saw in a relatively short period of time. Both types of athletes increased the size of their left ventricle, the mass of their left ventricle, by roughly the same amount, anywhere from 8 to 10%. But where things got interesting is when we looked at the geometry, and we used correlation analyses to do this. You can see here that the LV mass increase in the endurance athletes was almost all explained by dilation of the chamber, while in contrast, the increase in LV mass among the strength athletes was almost all attributed to thickening of the walls. So, rowing adaptation number 1, LV dilation. It is normal, adaptive, and beneficial in rowers and other types of endurance athletes to see not only dilation of the left ventricle, but four-chamber dilation. Large end diastolic volumes potentiate large stroke volumes. Another way of saying this is if the heart starts big, it's able to pump big. Most of you are familiar with this, nicknamed the Mitchell classification, and this is the classification that we in the States use to explain the physiology that's inherent in very different types of sports. This was first developed in 1985 by Dr. Jerry Mitchell and has been rewritten several times. I will publicly acknowledge, as one of the people that has rewritten this most recently, that this is not a perfect scheme. For those of you that are cricket fans, we made a mistake here. Cricket does not belong with golf, riflery, and bowling. It's just we as Americans don't appropriately understand cricket. But what this does do is it allows us to understand the inherent physiology in different sport types. You can see here on the X and Y axis, respectively, we have increasing dynamic and increasing static components. Another way of thinking about that is increasing pressure load and increasing volume load. And indeed, the endurance sports, as we know them, are on your right-hand side of the screen in the blue column. So let's take a look at some endurance physiology, and we're going to walk through several increasingly complex slides to understand the physiology of rowing. So to begin with, basic point number one, and that is that cardiac output and work are tightly linked. What you can see here are some nice representations of cardiac output versus VO2 curves in two populations, sedentary healthy people and trained athletes. And what you can see is that although there's a slightly curvilinear flow in the trained athlete, that the athlete's ability to generate a higher peak VO2 than a sedentary person is solely and simply derived from their ability to increase cardiac output. What do we know about this relationship? Well, it's best described by the Fick equation that says that VO2 is equal to cardiac output times the arteriovenous oxygen difference. We know that in healthy people, when we consider anything above moderate intensity activity, that we can really make the AVO2 oxygen difference negligible and think about cardiac output. So what we know is that VO2 is really dependent upon stroke volume and heart rate. Now, heart rate is not trainable. You simply cannot train your heart to go faster. In fact, as we get older, our peak heart rate comes down. So what is really the only trainable part of this equation is stroke volume. And there are three basic challenges that the left ventricle must obey when we think about generating stroke volume during exercise. And that is it must fill and do so at high heart rates. It must eject, and it must eject under high pressure. And it must do so by maintaining energetics. If the energetic balance of the heart falls off, then the adaptive hypertrophy that we know of becomes maladaptive very quickly. More on that in a few slides. So what I want to do to talk a little bit about the physiology of different types of endurance sports is use two of my patients, two of my athletes. These are folks that I've had the chance to work with from a performance optimization potential. The top is Michael DeSanto, who's been a many-time Olympic rower for our squad. The bottom is Jennifer Ryans, who's been the only woman in the U.S. to run in the Olympics at the 5, 10 kilometer as well as the marathon distance. And I want to show you some submaximal exercise testing data so we can understand how these sports are the same and how these sports are different. So let's start with a simple submaximal exercise test, 5 minutes of warm-up followed by 75% peak VO2 max effort on the rowing ergometer for a 10-minute period of time. And what you can see here is that Michael's heart rate goes up during the warm-up phase, basically plateaus during the plateau phase of work, and then comes down quickly after cessation. Very similar picture for Jennifer. As she warms up, her heart rate goes up. As she maintains her plateau at 75% peak VO2, her heart rate slowly creeps up. We'll talk about that in a second. But for all intents and purposes, heart rate is not different between these two sports. One thing I want to point out is that although the work rate it stays consistent during the plateau, that the heart rate creeps up. And for those of you that do any heart rate training, you'll recognize this as so-called heart rate creep, which is simply a sympathetic nervous system tone thing. This is a normal response in exercise. But the key take-home here is that heart rate and work are tightly coupled for all endurance activities. Now let's go ahead and let's introduce cardiac output onto this equation. So I've introduced a y-axis, and what you can see here is that cardiac output and heart rate do basically the same thing. They go up relatively quickly during the warm-up phase, they plateau or slightly creep up during the plateau phase, and then they drop quickly after the athlete starts. So very similarly, what we can see here is that cardiac output, again, which is the product of heart rate and stroke volume, is tightly coupled to work, and again, this is consistent across all endurance sports. So what differentiates rowing from running? Because they are not the same. To do that, we need to think about the parameter we haven't talked about yet, and that's blood pressure. So let me show you Jennifer's blood pressure. This is Jennifer running now. Again, the same exercise trial, although this time she has a radial arterial catheter in place so that we can measure her blood pressure, here shown as mean arterial pressure. And what you can see is that this goes up quickly, and then as she enters into the plateau phase, it actually comes down slowly as she continues to run. This is occurring because the peripheral arterial system is slowly vasodilating. This is the hallmark of the endurance athlete. This is an adaptive thing. Very, very different thing in Michael. So Michael starts rowing, his blood pressure goes up quite quickly, but then it continues to climb slowly over the course of his plateau. So what's going on here? Well, what's going on here is that first and foremost, Michael's operating at a higher mean arterial pressure, and he's not seeing that vasodilation that Jennifer is seeing. So what we can tell from these two examples is that arterial blood pressure is an endurance sports-specific thing. Let's hone in a little bit more detail here to really understand this. So I want to show you 10-second blood pressure tracings from these two athletes. First is Jennifer's. This is what it looks like. A diastolic pressure of 70, a systolic pressure of 170. This is nice pulsatile flow coming from her left ventricle, and she operates at a mean arterial pressure of 110. Good, healthy runner physiology. Now look at Michael. This is Michael's blood pressure. Very, very different. So in 10 seconds, what's happening 3 times? This is not something that's happening with his heart. These are the strokes of his erg cadence. And what's happening here is that every time he goes into the catch phase of his stroke, he contracts essentially every muscle briskly in his body, and his pressure surges through the roof, up well over 300 millimeters of mercury, sometimes 350, 400, giving him that higher mean arterial pressure. So what we know here is that rowing not only requires high cardiac output, but it requires high cardiac output in the face of high pressure. So this leads to the question, do these hearts look different? And indeed they do. And again, this is work from our Harvard Athlete Initiative comparing post-training hearts in rowers and runners. And what we can tell here is that both dilate, both hearts need to be dilated to generate that high cardiac output. But rowers, not only do they dilate, but they increase their wall thickness. And again, this is the schematic that shows this. You can go from a normal geometry through two divergent endurance sports to two very different looking hearts. And so this gets us to rowing adaptation number 2, and that is LV wall thickening. So it is normal for the rower to dilate and thicken proportionally. We call this left ventricular hypertrophy of the eccentric variant. And the reason for this is that this allows the pump to pump large volumes of blood at minimal energetic cost. And I'll show you some proof of concept data from that shortly. So having a big heart at rest and having a big heart during exercise are not necessarily synonymous. And I want to use the example of the guy lounging in the beach chair after a cocktail and these rowers out on the water pushing hard. They both may have big hearts because they're both athletic, but they're doing very different things. And let's take a look. So the heart of the guy on the beach chair is beating 60 times per minute, and what that means is that he's got 300 milliseconds to pump blood out, that's the systolic ejection period, and he's got 700 milliseconds to fill. Take those big hearts and get them moving, and what happens is that the time to eject blood shortens a little bit, you go from 300 to 200, but the time to fill, which is crucial, drops by orders of magnitude. And this represents the fundamental challenge of the endurance heart. It's not really the pumping that matters, it's the ability to fill in between those pumps. Because no matter how big you are, if you can't fill, you can't pump. So how does the endurance athlete's heart make this challenge occur? Well, I want to go back to this study because to this point, the strength endurance athlete thing has really only been proof of concept, again, proving that 1975 paper. But this is where new data started to emerge from this study. What we saw in these two athlete groups that developed divergent forms of left ventricular hypertrophy is that their function differed tremendously. Here we're looking at something called lateral E prime, which is diastolic relaxation velocity, meaning how quickly does the heart relax. And you can see that the larger the rower's heart got, the more compliant they got, the better they were at relaxing blood, the faster they relaxed. And that was in contrast to the strength athlete that actually thickened and got stiffer. But it's not just velocity. It's not just how quickly the heart can relax. It's how good a job it does sucking blood in. And that was a point that we were able to look at in some detail during this study of left ventricular twist mechanics. For those of you that don't think about heart function on a routine basis, I'll remind you that when the heart contracts, it doesn't just push blood out, it does so by twisting. The ventricle at the top and the bottom twist in different directions, rotate in different directions, and this twist actually propels blood out of the heart. And one of the questions we wanted to ask is among rowers who push their bodies hard and adapt, does this twist mechanism change? And indeed it does. What you can see here are twist curves. Focus on the blue parts of these curves before and after exercise, and indeed the hearts twisted better after a period of 90 days of training. But most importantly, not only did they twist more, but they untwisted more rapidly. And this is really important because it's the rapid untwisting during early diastole, particularly the amount of untwisting that occurs very early during what we call the isovolumic relaxation time, which allows the ventricle to develop negative pressure and suck blood in, that is the hallmark of the endurance heart. So rowing adaptation number 3 is enhanced LV relaxation. To some degree, this is a function of fiber speed and the intrinsic myocyte just relaxing better, but the bigger deal is the elastic recoil. They twist more, so they untwist. So one of the ways to think about this is strokers become suckers. So what about big hearts and their energetic efficiency? So when big hearts get sick in clinical cardiology, we know that they lose their ability to use energy efficiently, and we're learning this more intimately these days using techniques like positron emission tomography or PET scanning. And this is a representative PET scan using a C11 acetate tracer, which measures flow of energy through the glycolytic as well as the Krebs cycle. And what we can see here when you compare the normal heart and the dilated cardiomyopathic heart is that the sick heart loses its ability to use energy efficiently. Now, there are very few studies that have been done in athletes using PET, and so this is all preliminary, but I'll show you the first data set that we published just earlier this year. We were able, again, to take a small cohort of rowers and train them and watch this left ventricular hypertrophy develop in front of us. And the question we ask is, when the hearts get big, do they lose metabolic efficiency like the sick heart? And the answer is no. They maintain the same level of myocardial metabolic efficiency, this MME metric that we call it, as healthy controls. So not only were they pumping more blood and pumping more blood against higher afterload, but they were doing so at less energetic cost. So again, this probably is one of the most interesting features of the athlete's heart that has yet to really be teased out, is that of preserved energetics. More work, same energy, maybe substrate switching. This is a story we're still working on, but I think at the end of the day, this energetics is going to come out to be the holy grail of the athlete's heart. So how long does this take? Well, nothing happens overnight. Athletic adaptation occurs in discrete steps. And everything I've showed you up until this point have been relatively short-term training studies. But what happens if you study athletes over a longer period of time, which is what we did in this 4-year training study, again, of collegiate elite-level rowers? The answer is that things happen in phases. And what we see is that the early adaptation that occurs during that first 90 to 100 days is one of dilation of the ventricle, where in contrast, it takes time. Years for the ventricular walls to thicken, so years of high-level training. What you can see here is volume goes up early, thickness follows. This is the schematic that shows this. Again, left ventricular mass being driven by volume goes up first, and that's followed by wall thickness second with more increase in mass. So the take-home here is this is a stepwise process. You dilate before you thicken and you lengthen, and what we think about that early portion, that dilation, is that may actually largely be a passive process driven by vascular volume expansion, which we know is a normal adaptation during training intensification. And then finally, with respect to training studies, one of the questions that comes up all the time, and that is, do elite and sub-elite athletes who are both doing a lot of training really look different? And the answer is they do. So this is a study, this is old, this was done a decade ago. This was with the US men's crew before the Beijing Olympics, and this is a comparison between elite collegiate athletes. And the answer is, when you look under the hood and compare these hearts, are they different? And they are, because these individuals are different. The Olympians were on average 5 years older and were putting in double the amount of training, so 22 versus 11 hours a week, and had been rowing for twice as long. And it should go to bear that their hearts were bigger. They were bigger in the left ventricle, they were bigger in the right ventricle. So rowing adaptation number 6 is that competition level matters. This is probably to some degree a function of genetics based on what you're endowed with at baseline and your plasticity that comes at the level of the gene, or perhaps at the level of the gene post-translation. There's also a chronic training stimulus dose here, but what the take-home for those of us that look at the heart is what you see depends on who you study. So in the last few minutes, a controversial topic. So far, so good. Everything I've talked to you about is really a beneficial, adaptive thing that promotes performance, promotes physiology. But the question is, can you get too much of a good thing? And this is really where the scientific uncertainty lies in 2018. This is not a new topic. Take you back to 1899 in my hometown of Boston University. A physiologist by the name of Eugene Darling was studying rowers, and he published this paper, The Effects of Training. This is in the Boston Surgical and Medical Journal, now the New England Journal of Medicine. And Darling writes, "We have seen that a great increase in size and strength is demanded for the heart, and it may easily happen that it is called upon for more work than it is able to do, and that instead of establishing a compensatory hypertrophy, it becomes diluted and weakened. A broken-winded athlete is probably one with a dilated, flabby heart." So here we are in Boston 100 years later studying strain mechanics. This is an echocardiographic technique that allows us to look at how the heart squeezes and relaxes. And we make an interesting finding. We're again working with young collegiate rowers, and we're asking the question, does the heart's ability to squeeze change with training? And so we developed these strain maps, which look at the ventricle and the 3 principal vectors, longitudinal, radial, and circumferential, and everything's a good news story. The heart looks stronger after exercise, with one exception, and that is that the interventricular septum, the wall that separates the left and the right side of the heart, looks tired. So we go ahead and publish this paper, and when we publish this paper, we make another observation, and that is that not only does the interventricular septum look tired, but the people whose right ventricle, which we haven't talked about at all today yet, dilated the most, are the ones whose septum looked the most fatigued. So we published this paper with 2 lines in the discussion about the clinical relevance, and maybe fatigue is important, maybe it's not. And then I get a good call from Sanjay's colleague. We call him Sir White now, is that Greg? Sir White? Sir Greg White, who had put together this very nice series of masters athletes using cardiac MRI to look at tissue architecture. And what Greg found in this series, and I think you were on this paper, Sanjay, this is a great paper, they looked at whether or not these masters athletes had evidence of scar. And in a small percentage of them, they had scar tissue, which couldn't be explained by coronary disease. And so the question was whether it was exercise causing this. Almost at the same time, a paper published out of Belgium came out by André Lagersh, and I'm going to walk you through his paper in some detail because it's instructive, with this question of whether or not scar tissue in the hearts of masters athletes was caused by too much exercise. So let's look at André's study quickly. 40 trained athletes, greater than 10 hours of activity a week. They were competitive. They were free of symptoms, free of risk factors. They had no ischemia on stress echo prior to study. André and his group studied them with MRI, echo, biochemistry at 3 time points: before a race, immediately after a race, and then a week or so after that race had occurred. These were indeed legitimate masters athletes. They were marathoners, triathletes, cyclists, and you can see here, third from the bottom line, that they had between 140 and 160% peak VO2 based on age and gender predicted algorithms. So these are indeed competitive masters athletes. What happens when they race? Well, they demonstrate evidence of physiologic perturbation post-race. Their heart rate's up, their blood pressure's down, both in the systemic and the pulmonary vasculature, and their right ventricles look tired. So depressed systolic function, depressed diastolic function, simply tired, baggy hearts. Here's the schematic from that paper which explains it best. Post-race, the right ventricle is tired, doesn't pump as well, doesn't relax as well, it dilates, and it does so at the expense of the left heart. And there's the most stress of all is induced on that interventricular septum, which shifts over from the right to the left. Now, in 40 of these people, this is what the MRI looked like. So you see these white patches here in the heart that are illustrated by those arrows there. That's patchy myocardial scar, so fibrosis without any good explanation. So the question that was raised by this paper is whether or not this is a function of too much exercise over too much time. Now, this has yet to be reproduced, and there have been a number of studies which have tried to do so but failed to do so. We're not 100% certain what this really means. I would say that responsibly, the way to think about this now is to say that preliminarily, it's possible, based on the data, that a small minority of chronic endurance athletes develop a fibrotic cardiomyopathy. And at this point, it's a phenotype of uncertain clinical relevance that we need to study and understand better before we get too concerned. So if this happens, why might it happen? Because in my opinion, in the work we've done and in the clinical experience that we have seeing literally thousands of masters athletes, it's more than just exercise. So if this happens, this is what it probably looks like. There's chronic and extreme volume and intensity, so lots and lots of training. There's training and recovery mismatch, meaning not enough rest. There's almost certainly something at the level of the host, some susceptibility factor that we don't clearly understand. It's not typical cardiomyopathic genes. Those have been looked at and those have been vetted. But probably more importantly, it's a secondary process. Surreptitious use of drugs, occult infection, garden variety heart disease like hypertension that's not well controlled for in these models. And if this cascade occurs, it's probably possible to end up with a heart like this. But for those of you that are masters athletes and yourself in the room, I would tell you not to give up your sport yet, because this is not the majority, it's the minority. So in summary, to review what we've discussed, some key cardiac adaptations in rowers, and here they are. What you should expect and what is healthy. Biventricular growth, which from the perspective of the left ventricle, we know as a balanced wall thickening and chamber dilation, so-called eccentric left ventricular hypertrophy. Enhanced filling capacity, both because intrinsically the myocytes relax better and also because the ventricle uncoils more rapidly in the trained heart. Preserved energetics, meaning these hearts can do more work at a lower energy cost. There's a phasic entity to this remodeling, meaning there's an acute adaptation, which is highlighted by dilation, followed by a longer, more chronic adaptation, and during which the wall's thickened. We know that this is competition level phenotypically specific, meaning if you look at truly elite athletes versus sub-elite athletes, you should see variable degrees of the phenotype. And I think we've shown that it's fatigable, but whether it's injury prone with overuse remains a question that we'll have to stay tuned and wait for another decade of work to discern. I'll conclude with some thank yous and be happy to take any questions. I appreciate your attention.
Thank you very much for this huge database you delivered us, and are there questions behind? Last one, Carsten Lundby. The microphone is coming with the nicest lady.
Thank you for a superb talk. I was just wondering, you described now one side of this Frank Starling mechanism, the volumes. What about venous return? My question is, with exercise training, you have an improvement in blood volumes, and how much does this, in your opinion, relatively contribute to the improved cardiac output?
Yeah, I think it's a huge player, and particularly in that early phase of adaptation that I mentioned, where you see preferential dilation rather than wall thickening. I suspect that a large degree of that is simply plasma volume expansion in addition to augmented preload. So I think a lot of this dilation that we see that for many years we thought was truly myocardial remodeling is truly a volume phenomenon. And we actually have some blood volume data now to substantiate that. I think it's going to work out that plasma volume expansion, and we haven't published this yet, so this is preliminary, explains probably 70 to 80% of the dilation. It's a great question. Let's put it together.
Next question here, Tony Rice.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. At the end of your talk, you presented data comparing athletes before and after the marathon, and you concluded that after the marathon, there was a level of impairments, and some researchers call that cardiac fatigue and so forth. What is interesting when you look at those data, cardio output is actually elevated. So what do you define that there's fatigue when overall performance of the heart, indicated by cardio output, is actually elevated?
Yeah, I wouldn't be fooled by cardiac output, because you have to remember that these athletes are in a profound and prolonged state of vasodilation. So simply because their cardiac output is high, in order to ask the question whether cardiac output is commensurate or not for the amount of vasodilation is an important one. But when the vasodilation is fourfold and the cardiac output is up twofold, and you're seeing signs of fatigue in the heart, I think it's a pretty decent indicator that the heart's not meeting the demands of the peripheral vasodilation. So it's relative.
One way to look at that is you just measure oxygen consumption to determine whether the relationship between cardio output and VO2 is actually maintained or not.
You mean myocardial oxygen consumption?
Whole body oxygen consumption.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I mean, what you're getting at, and I would agree 100%, is that this term cardiac fatigue is a very messy one. And for people to just go put up echo data and say that the heart's tired without thinking about the rest of the circulatory system is a gross oversimplification. You'll notice there's never been a cardiac fatigue paper come out of my lab, because I don't think we really know how to study it yet. But I think it's a topic that gets oversimplified and brutalized quite too often.
Is I may?
We have to finish. We have.
I'm happy to take more questions. Thank you for your attention.
And thank you very much. And I give to my co-chair, Henning Bay Nielsen from Copenhagen.
Good evening, or good afternoon. So I would like to introduce you to the next speaker. This is Professor Corrado from University of Padua. Please welcome, and the floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman, dear colleagues, first of all, I would like to thank Professor Steinacker for inviting me here to talk about cardiac hypertrophy in athletes, what is normal. So the adaptive changes of the cardiovascular system to sustain intense physical exercise include neuroautonomic changes with increased vagal tone, structural changes with increase of ventricular mass of both ventricles, and functional changes with increased stroke volume. Today we'll focus on structural changes with particular reference of left ventricular hypertrophy of athlete's heart and induced by pathology. You can see here the major determinants of left ventricular hypertrophy in the remodeling of athlete's heart. Sport discipline, ethnicity, body size, gender, and age can be responsible for different kind of adaptive changes of the wall of the left ventricle, while illicit drugs and cardiomyopathy can induce a pathologic hypertrophy in the athlete. So it is well recognized that the type and intensity of sport can influence the adaptive changes of the heart, the so-called increase of left ventricular mass. The most extreme changes, left ventricular hypertrophy, increase of left ventricular thickness, as usually seen in the endurance sport such as cycling and rowing. And this is the law that describes the relationship between left ventricular wall stress and determinants of left ventricular wall stress. You can see here, left ventricular wall stress is the major determinant of left ventricular hypertrophy, secondary to sustained training. So left ventricular wall stress is directly proportional to left ventricular pressure and left ventricular radius, and inversely proportional to left ventricular wall thickness. So there is the need of an increase of left ventricular thickness to normalize left ventricular stress after increase of a pressure overload or a volume overload occurring in the setting of different sport disciplines. So according to the Morgan-Roth hypothesis, athletes engaged in endurance training usually develop an eccentric left ventricular hypertrophy as a result of a volume overload, predominantly a volume overload, while athletes engaged in strength training usually develop a concentric left ventricular hypertrophy as a result of a pressure overload. But this dichotomous distinction between physiology of that study cannot be applied to the majority of disciplines, of sport discipline, due to the variability of mixture of static and dynamic component of exercise. You can see here the different effects on left ventricular cavity size and left ventricular wall thickness of various sport disciplines. And you can see here, for example, cycling induces a proportional effect impact of both parameters, while strength sports such as weightlifting predominantly affect the left ventricular wall thickness. However, the very short duration of the burst of strength sport activity has a lower effect on remodeling of the heart compared with the endurance sport. This explains why in this study that was performed in Italy at the Center for Sport Medicine in Rome, the study found that no power athletes showed a left ventricular thickness exceeding the normal left ventricular thickness that is 12 millimeters. In other words, there were no athletes with the concentric hypertrophy and left ventricular wall thickness beyond the upper limits that consider physiology. So gender is a very important parameter that determines different degree of left ventricular wall thickness in athletes. And this seminal study performed at the National Italian Olympic Center in the 90s by Professor Pelliccia showed that the greatest left ventricular hypertrophy in Caucasian athletes is seen in males. You can see here that the left ventricular thickness ranged from 8 to 16 millimeters in this cohort of athletes, but only 2% had a left ventricular wall thickness of 13 millimeters or more. So according to these results, in Caucasian males athletes, the upper limit of normal wall thickness is currently regarded as 12 millimeters. So this is an example of the classic remodeling of the heart in endurance athlete. You can see here hypertrophy, an increase of left ventricular mass with hypertrophy, in this case around 13 millimeter, that is proportional, is very important, proportionally to the increase of cavity size. In other words, we have an increase of left ventricular mass without systolic dysfunction and or alteration dysfunction of the diastolic function of the heart. So it's important to consider that there is a difference between males and females. In female athletes, usually the left ventricular hypertrophy occurs to a lesser extent compared with males. Always in the Italian study, you can see here that the mean maximal left ventricular wall thickness in females, in yellow, was much lower than wall thickness in males. And you can see here that non-females had a wall thickness beyond the 12 millimeters that we consider the upper limits of physiological left ventricular hypertrophy. Only males had, 2% of males had an increased left ventricular wall thickness more than 12 millimeters. So the reason why males develop greater left ventricular hypertrophy must include higher circulating androgen testosterone levels, higher level mean blood pressure during exercise, and probably gender variation in body size. So another important determinant in left ventricular hypertrophy is race. In the past, most of study on athletes' heart focused on white Caucasian athletes. Recently, there are a lot of studies addressing the left ventricular remodeling in athletes of Afro-Caribbean descent. And this study consistently showed that the left ventricular wall thickness in black athletes is much higher compared with white Caucasian athletes. You can also see here that compared with white Caucasian athletes, black athletes significantly more often showed increase of left ventricular wall thickness beyond the upper limit of normality. You can see here that 18% in this study from United Kingdom, from London, 18% of black athletes had the left ventricular wall hypertrophy more than 20 millimeters, and 3% of 15 millimeters or more. So there's a clear difference between white athletes and black athletes in terms of propensity to develop a left ventricular wall thickness increase. And also females, black athletes showed a much higher wall thickness compared with white female athletes. You can see here that 3% of black female athletes had an hypertrophy of more than 11 millimeters compared with not Caucasian female athletes. Genetic factors also play an important role. Of course, the response of the heart to exercise results from a complex interaction between a genetic background and environmental factors. A number of candidate genes have been identified that can influence the response of the heart to physical exercise. The AC gene was the most studied, and was demonstrated that this variant, this two allelic deletion of the gene was associated with a greater response in terms of left ventricular hypertrophy in athletes compared with the other insertion and double insertion. So in other words, the gene can predispose to development of greater left ventricular wall thickness and left ventricular hypertrophy in athletes. This is a very elegant, very recent study performed in London by the Sharma's group that addressed the geographic impact, the geographic determinant on the response of the heart to physical exercise in terms of remodeling. This is the take-home figure I provide because I wrote an editorial to the paper that is summarizing the results of this very interesting study. You can see here that black athletes coming from Western Africa and Central Africa usually have a left ventricular hypertrophy that tends to be concentric, more than 12 millimeters, and associated with electrocardiographic abnormalities in terms of repolarization abnormalities, compared with black athletes coming from Northern and Eastern Africa that instead show a normal wall thickness without important electrocardiographic abnormalities. Of course, is another expression of a different genetic background of these athletes. So a few words about the electrical remodeling of the heart reflecting the left ventricular hypertrophy. This is a document that was published a few years ago by our section Sport Cardiology concerning the recommendation for interpretation of 12 with the electrocardiogram in the athlete. And you can see here that we divided the ECG abnormalities in two main groups. The group 1 included common and training-related ECG changes such as sinus bradycardia, first-degree AV block, incomplete right bundle branch block, early repolarization, and most importantly, isolate QRS voltages criteria for left ventricular hypertrophy. Instead, group 2 abnormalities comprise uncommon and training-unrelated ECG changes such as repolarization abnormalities, wave inversion, ST segment aberration, pathologic Q wave, and other abnormalities. Which is the difference? These abnormalities are probably reflects the normal adaptation of the normal electrical remodeling of the heart to physical exercise. Instead, these abnormalities are not physiological and suggest the possibility of cardiovascular pathology and needs, when present, to be further investigated in order to exclude an underlying cardiovascular disease. So this is a typical electrocardiogram of a highly trained athletes showing a pure increase of QRS voltages in the absence of depolarization or repolarization abnormalities. So the most important challenge for sport medical doctors and sport cardiologists is screening athletes for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. That implies differential diagnosis between physiologic hypertrophy and pathologic hypertrophy that usually consists of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and this condition is inherited, is a genetic cardiomyopathy as heart muscle disorder characterized by disproportionate left ventricular hypertrophy, myocardial disarray that can histologically demonstrated, and important repolarization abnormalities in the electrocardiogram. So up to 2-4% of Caucasian athletes, as we said before, and up to 18% of Afro-Caribbean athletes show left ventricular wall thickening that falls into the so-called gray zone, comprised between 13 and 16 millimeters, and thus raises problem of differential diagnosis of this kind of physiologic adaptation of the heart with mild hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. So this is an example of an athlete with left ventricular wall thickness in the gray zone, 13 millimeters, and an hypertrophic cardiomyopathy patient with the same, with a mild hypertrophic cardiomyopathy showing the same degree of left ventricular wall thickness. The difference between the two cases is the size of the left ventricular cavity. You can see here that in the athlete, 13 millimeters of left ventricular wall thickness was associated with 57 millimeters of cavity size, while in the hypertrophic cardiomyopathy patient, always 13 millimeters were instead associated with a small cavity, 48 millimeters. So in the athletes with left ventricular hypertrophy, left ventricular wall thickness falling into the gray zone, we need a very important, very accurate approach for differential diagnosis that rely on a series of clinical, imaging, electrocardiographic, and genetic factors. So it's a polyparametric approach in order to reach a differential diagnosis. First of all, the pattern of left ventricular hypertrophy. In hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, there is a pathologic hypertrophy. You can observe a symmetric of segmental left ventricular wall thickness. You can see here the dishomogeneous pattern of left ventricular hypertrophy, mostly confined to the septum or the lateral wall, that may be associated with left ventricular outflow tract obstruction, mostly due to the basal hypertrophy of the septum associated with the systolic anterior motion of the anterior leaflet of the mitral valve. So in this case, these features, of course, suggest an hypertrophic cardiomyopathy rather than a physiologic adaptation of the heart, a heart's heart, because in the heart, the hypertrophy is homogeneous and symmetric. Another important, probably the most important parameter for differential diagnosis is the cavity size. In other words, in the athlete's heart, usually the increase of left ventricular wall thickness is associated with a proportional concomitant increase of left ventricular wall thickness, while in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, the cavity is small. This paper from the Italian Olympic Center showed that 54 millimeters is an important cutoff for distinguishing this in terms of cavity size for distinguishing physiologic hypertrophy of athlete's heart in blue versus pathologic hypertrophy of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. In other words, athletes with left ventricular wall thickness falling in the gray zone usually show a cavity size more than 54 millimeters, while hypertrophic cardiomyopathy patients show a small cavity with a cavity size less than 54 millimeters. These are the most important parameters for differentiation. So cardiac MRI is very helpful for differential diagnosis. First of all, because cardiac MRI allows a better delineation of the hypertrophy, mostly concerning segmental hypertrophy. For example, segmental hypertrophy occurring in the lateral anterior wall of the left ventricle, or hypertrophy occurring in the apex of the left ventricle in patients with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy that can be missed by echocardiography. And most importantly, cardiac MRI has the unique ability to demonstrate myocardial fibrosis, intramyocardial fibrosis that can be demonstrated by late gadolinium enhancement pattern. You can see here these areas of increased intensity of the signal after gadolinium injection is expression of fibrosis of the myocardium. You can see here different patterns of intramyocardial fibrosis. These myocardial fibrosis seen by late gadolinium enhancement correspond to this area at postmortem of fibrosis in the setting of left ventricular hypertrophy, and this fibrosis is not regional like that observed in the setting of the traditional myocardial infarction. Instead, it's patchy, as you can see here, patchy areas, and is due to an ischemic damage due to the small vessel disease that's characteristic aspect pathology of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. So cardiac MRI also allows to identify accessory morphological abnormalities such as mitral valve elongation, abnormal papillary muscle insertion, in this case, or crypts that can suggest that favor the diagnosis of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy rather than of athlete's heart. Less helpful findings for diagnosis of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy compared with athlete's heart are left atrial enlargement, diastolic dysfunction, and reduction of exercise performance, because the value of these parameters show a large overlaps between athlete's heart and hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. For example, you can see here that usually 20% of athletes show left atrial transverse dimension more than 40 millimeters, and 2% more than 45 millimeters. When I compare with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, you can see that there is a large overlaps between values that, of course, don't facilitate diagnosis. Another important aspect is the parameter aspect for differential diagnosis is the reverse of hypertrophy, or physiologic hypertrophy of athlete's heart after 6-8 weeks of the training. In other words, to interrupt the athletic performance for 6-8 weeks reverses completely the electrical and the structural remodeling of the heart with the normalization of the electrocardiogram and complete regression of increased left ventricular wall thickness. A few words about the differential diagnosis based on the electrocardiogram. The electrocardiogram may be very useful for differential diagnosis. In the athlete's heart, usually the ECG, as showed before, is characterized by just an increase of the amplitude of the QRS. Instead, in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy patients, there is usually the presence of STT alterations, in other words, abnormalities of the repolarization and the pathologic Q waves. You can see that in athletes, these parameters are usually absent. So it's an example of repolarization abnormalities in an athlete dying suddenly, T-waves inversion in the lateral leads, and this is the echo showing extreme left ventricular hypertrophy and at post-mortem the diagnosis of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy with the myocardial disarray. So attention should be paid instead to T-waves inversion in the anterior leads. So this pattern can be physiological, can be normal when occurs in the setting of early repolarization. In other words, mostly in Afro-Caribbean athletes, you can have T-waves inversion that occur in the setting of early repolarization. In this particular case, this T-waves inversion in anterior leads is preceded by J-point elevation. Compare instead with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, in which the T-wave in anterior leads is associated with a baseline J-point. So in other words, this is the athlete's T-waves inversion in anterior leads that is characterized by T-waves inversion preceded by J-point elevation, and instead in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, the J-point is at baseline, suggesting this is a cardiomyopathic T-waves inversion, instead it is a physiologic T-waves inversion. So finally, genetics, molecular genetics may offer the possibility to increase our accuracy for differential diagnosis by demonstrating the presence of a pathogenic mutation in the gene encoding for sarcomeric proteins. You can see here that at the present time we know a lot of causative gene abnormalities, gene anomalies, gene defects responsible for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and over 1,400 mutations. There are, unfortunately, the limitations of genetic testing. And the limitations are that usually they yield for positive gene testing in probants, that means in the setting of a familial disease, is around 50%. So 50% are not genotyped and show a negative genotype. And most importantly, less than 30% show a yield positive gene testing individuals outside family screen, that means sporadic cases. So in other words, those in which would be particularly important to demonstrate the genetic background of the disease. Even more important is the increasing demonstration of variants by molecular genetics of uncertain clinical significance. That means polymorphisms of genetic variants that we don't know how to interpret. So this high prevalence of likely benign variants of uncertain significance or likely probably pathogenic makes the genetic molecular genetics testing often more confounding than confirming. So in summary, there is a proportion of athletes showing a left ventricular wall thickness beyond the upper limits of physiology, and this is observed in Caucasian, but even more often in 10 times greater in black athletes. In those athletes with the left ventricular hypertrophy falling in the gray zone, 13 to 16 millimeters, the differential diagnosis is based on a polyparametric approach considering clinical, imaging, ECG, and genetics factors. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience? There's a microphone over here. First row. Oh, Estonia.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Corrado. I have a question about 80% of African athletes who have more than 12 millimeters in the wall thickness.
Yes.
Okay. Are they or have they some other pathologic symptoms? For example, are they asymptomatic? Have they some pathologic symptoms related to sports? Have they abnormalities in ECG, or they are normal, no disorders? And then should sports medicine physicians who make examination of aptitude to sports, should physicians make systematically echocardiographic for especially African athletes, especially if they are professional footballers or high level? Thank you.
Usually this kind of, in athletes with physiological hypertrophy, that is important, that's beyond the upper limits of physiology, in black athletes are usually asymptomatic. In other words, this hypertrophy is not associated with symptoms. And with regard instead of ECG, the ECG is more often abnormal in those black athletes with increased left ventricular wall thickness beyond the upper limits. And usually we can observe T-wave subversion, mostly T-wave subversion in the lateral leads. And so it's very important, especially in those with these ECG abnormalities, because screening usually starts with ECG. So according to the Italian protocol, we perform a first-line examination including ECG, and only those with ECG abnormalities undergo echocardiographic examination in order to exclude the suspect or confirm or have a cardiac disease. So I think that we can respect this sequence. In other words, this protocol, this algorithm, only those with ECG abnormalities should undergo echocardiographic examination, unless you have the possibility to perform systematic echocardiographic examination in your cohort of athletes that, of course, increase the sensitivity for identification of pathologic hypertrophy in these athletes.
The questions. Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Then we just move on to next speaker, and Jürgen.
Yeah. We have next, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
There is one question remaining which we discussed together with Professor Sharma, which is the next speaker. The scars in arm baggage scans and the Heitbügel scans we have to discuss together later on. And I'm very pleased that we have Dr. Sanjay Sharma from University of London in the special unit on inherited cardiac diseases in sport cardiology here for us for this presentation. And it was a very shocking but very interesting finding he presented in the literature, and he was already present in the last meeting 4 years ago, but now he has also new data, and we are very interested in this data.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm going to be talking about the heart of the aging athlete and the role of chronic coronary stress in these athletes. The benefits of exercise on the cardiovascular system are very well established. We know that people who exercise regularly are less likely to be obese and therefore have insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes mellitus. We also know that people who exercise regularly have a good blood pressure and lipid profile, and through curbing all of these risk factors for atherosclerosis, people who exercise regularly reduce their risk of an adverse event from coronary artery disease by around 50% when they're in their 5th and 6th decade. There is emerging evidence that exercise increases DNA telomerase activity, and by doing so, it may actually halt the aging process to some extent. And this may explain why sports people have a lower prevalence of certain cancers, such as cancer of the breast, the prostate, the colon, and the endometrium. Indeed, there is an inverse relationship between inverse relationship between cardiorespiratory fitness and total mortality. So there are several benefits of exercise, and all of our governments recommend some form of exercise, and this is the recommendation from the British government that everybody should be doing 30 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity at least 5 days per week, or 25 minutes of vigorous activity 3 days per week. However, of course, our endurance athletes, including our rowers, exercise at least 15 to 20 times the current recommendations, and to do so, they need to be able to generate an increase in cardiac output from 5 litres per minute at rest to around 30 litres per minute at peak exercise, and they need to be able to do this for several minutes, if not hours. Now, data from young rowers pertains only to the ECG and the echocardiogram, and we know that young rowers have slow heart rates, as you've just heard. They have large QRS complexes. They get a 10% increase in left and right ventricular dimensions, a 10 to 20% increase in left ventricular wall thickness. They have large stroke volumes, which they can augment even at rapid heart rates. And as Dr. Baggish has explained to you, they need to be able to fill their hearts very efficiently in diastole, even at rapid heart rates, and they can do so. And the end product is a high peak oxygen consumption. We know from the Italian series that if we look at young Olympian rowers, even those that have competed for 3 consecutive Olympics, that ongoing intensive exercise does not cause progressive enlargement of the left ventricle over several years, and neither does it appear to cause dysfunction of the left ventricle. And when these rowers retire, here is data on 44 Italian rowers, and when they retire, over time, the left ventricular wall thickness regresses back to normal, and the left ventricular cavity size almost starts hitting normal levels, and that's led us all to believe that cardiovascular adaptation to exercise is a physiological process which is entirely benign and is entirely reversible. Let me take you back to these endurance athletes. These endurance athletes really do astound us with their extraordinary physical ability and their physical stamina, and it's for this reason that there is a surging increase in the number of people participating in mass endurance events such as the marathon, the triathlon, and the Ironman. Now, clearly, as one ages, the peak oxygen consumption drops, and it does so because maximal heart rate drops, and there are various changes in the skeletal muscle that result in a drop in peak oxygen consumption. Now, the good news for all of you is that sarcopenia, which is muscle bulk, does not actually take its full effect until the 7th decade. So the skeletal muscle ages very little between the 5th decade and 7th decade. Furthermore, it's the type 2 or the fast twitch fibers that drop before the type 1 fibers, and therefore older people or older individuals can continue to engage in endurance sport for quite a long time. We don't have much data on mass rowing events because there aren't any, but we've got lots of data on mass marathon events. And what we find here is that 40% of our marathon entrants in London, certainly 40% of our men, are aged over 40, and around 1/3 of our women are aged over 40. And if you ever examine ultra-marathon events, these are marathons that go on for 24 hours or so, these events are largely populated by individuals between 40 and 65 years old. Now, clearly, this sort of data suggests that older athletes are good at just plodding along at a very steady pace. But I would like to challenge that. Some of these older athletes can do extreme amounts of exercise, as many of you will know from our Masters rowers. Here is data showing you the finishing times of various running events in the first ever Olympic event in 1896. And on this side here, on the right, you will see the times of veteran athletes that have surpassed the winning times. Just look at the marathon time. In 1898, the winner of the marathon finished it in 2 hours, 58 minutes and 50 seconds. That record was broken by a 73-year-old man who finished it in 2 hours and 54 minutes. To give you some idea that some of these guys can do an extraordinary amount of work. And as I said, our master rowers are no exception. Clearly, one thing that we all worry about when an older athlete gets into a boat or starts running is their potential risk of a cardiac arrest. Although exercise is extremely good for reducing atherosclerotic burden, we know that if you have a vulnerable myocardium or a coronary plaque and you exercise, there's a chance that exercise may actually trigger sudden cardiac arrest. The good news is that that is a relatively uncommon finding, and it occurs in around 1 in 50,000 individuals. Here you've got 2 bar charts from the French population, exercising population, aged between 10 and 70 years old. Here, there were a few deaths, mainly in men around the age of 48 years old. The red bars show you death rates in our young competitive athletes, the sort of people that win all these gold medals at the Olympics and excite our nations. Very few, only made up 6% of all deaths. The vast majority of deaths occur in recreational, middle-aged or older athletes, and autopsy data in these individuals suggest that the vast majority die from atherosclerotic coronary artery disease. You've also heard earlier, briefly, that people who exercise a lot, if they finish exercise and if you measure their blood markers, they often have a rise in serum cardiac troponin level and the serum brain natriuretic peptide levels. These are markers of cardiac damage. And it's led some to believe that this leak that you find in the bloodstream of athletes after they've finished an event may represent myocardial inflammation, myocyte necrosis, which may go on to cause adverse cardiac remodeling, cardiac dysfunction, or even cardiac arrhythmias. Now, we certainly have data in rats to show that that may well be the case. Here is information from rats that were exercised for an hour for 16 weeks. Each day they exercised for an hour, forcefully. During life, their ventricles were stiff. It was easy to induce ventricular tachycardia, and when they were sacrificed, there was scar noted in their atria and in their right ventricles. Now, clearly, we don't have that sort of data in human beings, and you can't extrapolate studies on rats that are exercised forcefully to human beings, but there are some worrying headlines that you may have all read about. We've seen data to tell you that mild to moderate amounts of exercise are good, but very, very strenuous forms of exercise may be bad. So some people have proposed a reversed J-shaped phenomenon. You may have also read that marathon runners have more calcium in their coronary arteries than matched individuals of the same Framingham risk, and some of these marathon runners also have scars in their vessels. I should point out to all of you, these are all cross-sectional studies, so we don't really know what the significance of these findings is, and that a large proportion of these studies have enrolled athletes who had established risk factors for coronary atherosclerosis. For example, in one study, almost 50% were either current smokers or former smokers. So we don't really know what happens to someone who has rowed all their life. What happens to a normal heart with time? Clearly, we've got fixed risk factors such as the normal aging process and the possibility of genetic predisposition that may make some athletes more vulnerable to other athletes of something going on. And of course, these people are subject to stresses from toxins and infections when they compete in different parts of the world. With age, they also may acquire risk factors for atherosclerosis, and superimposed upon that, we've got to take into account the stresses of the increased preload and afterload for several hours that is actually imposed upon the heart by exercise. So I'd like to give you some data of where we are at the moment. This is our Veteran Athletes Heart Project. We wanted to do something very clean, where we took athletes who didn't have any risk factors for coronary artery disease, so didn't smoke, didn't have high blood pressure, didn't have diabetes, didn't have a high cholesterol, and didn't have a family history of cardiac disease. The numbers are quite small, 152, because it's very hard to find people who've exercised all their lives that have got no risk factors at all. But we enrolled people aged over 40 who'd exercised for more than 10 years and were free of cardiovascular risk factors, and we compared them with 92 people of socioeconomic class 1 or 2, a lot like some of you in the audience, who really do look after yourselves, don't smoke, know your blood pressures, know your lipid profile, and really look after yourselves and maybe jog once or twice a week. And we subjected them to lots and lots of tests. And this is the demographics of our group. Of the 152 athletes, 70% were men. That was one of the probable criticisms. We only did 30% women. The mean age, though, was exactly what I'm talking about. Your middle-aged athlete, 51 years old. Their Framingham risk score was 4.3, so they were low risk of atherosclerosis. And their exercise history was pretty decent. Mean exercise history of 31 years. These were predominantly marathon runners, 77% marathon runners. The median marathon runs was 13, but several had run over 100 marathons. And we had national champions and 5 world champions. Our control group was matched for age and Framingham score. I don't expect you to be able to read all of this, but this is data on cardiac size and cardiac function. And Aaron Baggage just touched upon this in young athletes. Compared with controls, we found that our athletes had a 14% greater increase in left ventricular wall thickness compared to controls, a 10% greater increase in left ventricular volume, and an 11% increase in stroke volume. This is qualitatively similar to the differences you find when you compare young athletes with young controls. So the qualitative change is relatively similar. However, compared to young athletes, 12% of our veteran athletes had a left ventricular wall thickness of more than 12 millimeters. You'll have learned from Dr. Corrado that in white people, only around 2% of young athletes have a wall thickness of more than 12. So veteran athletes get more left ventricular hypertrophy in terms of thickened walls than our young athletes. But only 20% had a large LV cavity, defined as an LV cavity of more than 54, whereas nearly half of our young athletes have big cavities. So one of these things that we can say is that veterans get thicker hearts, and I suspect that's because they've got a stiffer aorta, so they've got a bigger afterload to pump against, and they probably have higher blood pressure responses compared to younger athletes. And because they haven't got the skeletal muscle to do as much exercise as our young rowers, they do not have the same preload, and therefore their ventricles do not enlarge as much as our young athletes. But the crux of my talk was to talk about coronary stress. And I'm going to talk to you about coronary artery calcification. Please forgive me if some of this is a little bit basic, but I know I'm not speaking only to cardiologists. But coronary artery calcification is highly prevalent in people with coronary artery disease, and it's often the end result of damage to the endovascular lining. The coronary artery's calcium score is a surrogate for your atherosclerotic volume, and it's associated with higher cardiovascular morbidity and higher cardiovascular mortality. We know that progression of coronary artery calcification is a strong predictor of future adverse cardiac events. And cardiologists often use the coronary artery calcium score for risk stratification and intensifying therapy in athletes with recognized atherosclerotic risk factors. So what did we find? When we made comparisons between athletes and controls, we found the following. And the first thing you'll note, I'm only talking about males here. And that's because we didn't find any exciting news in females. That can only be good. Females didn't show more calcium, female athletes, compared to female controls, but men did. So if you look here, males and male controls and male athletes were matched for age and Framingham risk. Around 55% had a coronary artery calcium score of 0. But if you look at a coronary artery calcium score of more than 100, there was a signal that male athletes are more likely to have a coronary artery calcium score of more than 100. Indeed, our study showed that 1 in 5 male veteran athletes have a coronary artery calcium score of more than 100. And when we looked at this in a little bit more detail and looked specifically at those with very high coronary artery calcium scores, we found that 11.5% of our male veteran athletes had a coronary artery calcium score of 300 or more compared to none of our controls. When we looked further at the number of plaques, i.e. the number of furring ups that you see in a coronary artery, the controls were in the blue bars and the athletes were in the red bars, we found that our athletes had twice the number of plaques compared to our controls. And when we looked at the number of narrowings, tight narrowings, or well, not tight, but moderate narrowings, people with narrowings of more than 50%, we found that in 7.5% of our veteran athletes compared to none of our controls. And this starts getting you a little bit worried. Are we trying to say that ideal therapy, that is exercise, could possibly become the bitter pill for some people? So we looked carefully at the plaque morphology. So you've got two box plots here, one in male athletes and one in male controls. The white box represents calcified plaque, the light grey box represents mixed morphology plaque, and the dark grey box represents soft plaque. Again, excuse me if I'm being slightly patronizing, but calcified plaques are plaques that cardiologists recognize as stable. These plaques are cemented, they're less likely to rupture and less likely to cause occlusion of a coronary artery. In contrast, it's the soft plaques, the dark black and the light grey ones, that could rupture and cause heart attacks. So although our athletes had more plaques, the plaques in our athletes were predominantly calcified and stable. So what I can tell you here is that there's no doubt that twisting and torsion of the heart 90,000 times a day, especially very vigorous exercise, must be causing some damage to the coronary artery linings. But the repair mechanisms in these athletes appear to be different to those in people who smoke a lot and have high cholesterol, in that they get mainly calcified plaques. We weren't the only people to show this. A much bigger study in 318 middle-aged men with a low Framingham risk score and who were able to do lots and lots of exercise also showed that around half had a coronary artery calcium score of 0, and 1 in 5 either had a coronary artery calcium score of more than 100 or a luminal narrowing of more than 50%. These investigators then went on to look at the dose of exercise versus the amount of narrowings and the amount of calcium. And they divided their athletes, all men again, into those that did less than 1,000 minutes. That's not a lot of exercise. That's about 2 hours of intensive exercise a week. Those that did between 1,000 and 2,000 METs, and those that did more than 2,000 METs. And they found that with increasing amount of exercise, the number of athletes with a coronary artery calcium score of 0 decreased. In other words, the coronary artery calcium went up in those who exercised the most. They also looked at plaques. In those that exercised the most, coronary artery plaques also increased. And when they looked at the morphology of the plaques, your black bars are your calcified plaques, and your calcified plaques in people who exercise more than 2,000 METs, you will see that the guys that exercised the most, although they had more plaques, most of their plaques were calcified. And as I said to you, we believe that these are stable. And how can I impress upon you that these may be stable? Well, that data comes from statin therapy. When someone has a myocardial infarction, we marinate them in statins. Statins don't just reduce your cholesterol level, they're also anti-inflammatory, and we believe that they may actually stabilize atherosclerotic plaques. Here is data from 8 meta-analysis doing intravascular ultrasound of nearly 3,500 people, where 200 odd had no statin therapy, about 1,700 had low-intensity statin, and around 1,500 had high-intensity statin. And you can see from the blue bars, that's your total atherosclerotic plaque volume, that statin therapy brought down your atherosclerotic plaque volume. But paradoxically, it increased the amount of calcium in your plaques. So we believe that what statins do is that they polymerize microcalcifications in the plaque and make them very stable. And it may be that runners do get plaques, but those plaques are stable and don't do very much to that runner. Again, this is cross-sectional data, so we can't really comment on what the outcomes are. But if we look at my marathon and Aaron's marathon, death rates in marathons are about 1 in 68,000. We don't get many deaths, and we have many, many veteran individuals running this. So what if you've got someone who's got calcium and they're extremely fit? What does that actually mean? This is beautiful data published in Circulation in over 8,000 men, where they had cardiorespiratory fitness data and they had the coronary artery calcium score, and they followed these people up for a respectable 8.5 years. They looked at deaths, myocardial infarction, stroke in 4 types of categories. People who had a coronary artery calcium score of 0, people with a coronary artery calcium score of between 1 and 100, people with a coronary artery calcium score of between 100 and 399, and people with very high coronary artery calcium scores of more than 400. So if you had a low coronary artery calcium score or 0 coronary artery calcium score, your risk of an adverse event was 0.1% versus 1.9% if you had a very high coronary artery calcium score. Your risk of death was 2% per annum if you had no coronary artery calcium versus 18% if you had a lot of coronary artery calcium. But if you were fit, the fitter you were, the less likely you were to have an adverse event with high coronary artery calcium. So for every MET you were able to exercise, your risk of something bad happening to you dropped by 14%. So calcium in our rows may not mean what you actually think it means in someone who smokes a lot. I really wanted to, this is the first time I'm presenting this data. Our data was flawed in a way because we only had data in 30% women. We compared like for like, i.e. our women were the same age as our men, and yet we know that women age 10 years later when it comes to their cardiovascular system. This is the first time I'm showing this. This is a really respectable data set of 221 veteran athlete females and 57 controls. You'll see they're roughly about 55 years of age. The years of exercise, 32 years. Hours of exercise, around 8.4 hours per week. 67% of our women were menopausal, postmenopausal, so that it tells you that now their risk could be similar to men maybe. And they were really true athletes. You can see from their peak VO2s in terms of percentages, they had a mean peak VO2 of 168% predicted. But there must be a hormonal thing, because we did not find greater calcium in our women compared to our controls. Indeed, we found our controls had more calcium than our women. So the plot thickens. We don't see this phenomenon in women, we only see it in men. There could be lots of reasons for this. It could be the anabolic hormone, it could be the blood pressure responses, it could be the vigor with which they are able to exercise. This type of scarring that you see, this type of coronary artery remodeling you see, does it cause scarring in the hearts? We found scarring, what we call worrying scarring, in 11% of our athletes, almost exclusively in our men, and this was independently associated with age. We were clearly looking at scarring that represents myocardial infarction. A third of all those scars represented a previous myocardial infarction. Now, I say a third, but that equals N equals 3. So 3 out of every 100 veteran athletes have scar that suggests that they've had a heart attack at some stage, and only a small number of these people had narrowings in the coronary artery supplying that, suggesting that there may be a demand ischemia that could cause enough damage to cause an ischemic scar in a small proportion of people. But as I said again, this is cross-sectional data. We don't really know what happens to these people when we go on. So to reassure you all, here is some very important data. In 661 people, median age 62, so just the sort of people that we're talking about. And I know this is good data because the follow-up is good, and during the follow-up there have been loads and loads of deaths, 116,000 deaths in this cohort. And what they showed is that if you exercised what our government tells you, you reduce your risk of mortality by 20%. If you exercise twice as much as what our government tells you, you reduce your risk of all-cause mortality by 31%. If you do so between 3 to 5 times what our government tells you, you reduce your risk by 37%. If you do 5 times more than what our government tells you, you reduce your risk by 39%. If you do 10 times more what our government tells you, you don't seem to increase your risk of dying. And again, I tell you this is respectable data because 54% of people that were doing 5 to 10 times more than the amount of exercise they should have been doing were middle-aged, aged between 60 and 70, and this showed no harm. And one thing I should tell you all before I depart from the stage is that there is no doubt that people who exercise regularly live longer than people who don't. There's plenty of data to say that athletes live between 4 to 7 years longer than non-athletes. So in summary, master athletes, these are older athletes, achieve qualitatively similar adaptation to cardiac structure as young athletes. There is emerging evidence that a proportion show high coronary artery calcium scores and myocardial fibrosis. The significance and mechanisms for these findings is uncertain. Middle-aged and older athletes do have an increased risk of AF, which I didn't touch upon, but this appears to be negated by reduced all-cause mortality. We need further large prospective longitudinal studies to investigate the cause and significance of adverse cardiac remodeling and arrhythmias in our aging athletes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sanjay, for this interesting review. So, are there questions? So there's calcification, and we both were relaxed as you said, okay, but you live longer, even with calcium. So that's something which relieved here the podium. The others I didn't see. But here, there's a question behind. But the scars of Aaron, a little bit, we have also discussed.
Thank you. That was very illuminating. I have a role in British rowing, but I train in a normal rowing club, and we have a lot of masters athletes, and quite a significant number of our men have AF, but none of our women. And I know that you've said you can't tell yet, and there's a lot, but do you have a feeling that there is a protection of gender against AF?
No, there's no doubt about it. There is a much higher prevalence of atrial fibrillation in male athletes than in females. And it's the same as everything else that we're reporting, that male athletes get more calcium in their arteries, they get more scarring, they certainly get more atrial fibrillation. And certainly what I'm seeing in rowing is that atrial fibrillation is occurring at a younger and younger age. And you may have heard in the press, you've all read about this, a lot of your gold medalists have had to have ablations to make sure that they may be ready for Tokyo because they want to try and get that gold then as well. So this is not secrets, this is all in the news. But so yes, we are seeing that. We're not seeing it, well, we are seeing it in some females, but very uncommon compared
So
to...
you're not expecting a surge because women haven't been training like lunatics as much as men have for as long. So, I mean, this is generalization, but I've been around quite a long time. And
well, I think if you look at, you may be right, some people like you have, but if you look at the mass population, I think there have been more men that have been exercising at a very high level, simply because they were encouraged to do so more than anything else, than there have been females. And maybe time may suggest that women are more at risk, but my hunch is that it's not going to be the case. Having seen all the other pathology I'm seeing in the heart, and seeing the fact that the men get the biggest hearts, and I think that's got something to do with why they develop atrial fibrillation, that you will see more AF in men. But what I should again reassure you with that we're not seeing the strokes and the heart failure in our males with AF as we do in the general population.
Regarding the AF, which is another topic, some people, some rhythmologists which I work with say this is also confounded by the beer consumption of the male population, which is much higher than in the females.
You mean, yes, alcohol. Well, again, I would have certainly said that 20 years ago, where sport was less professional than it is now. But certainly when I talk to our British rowers, and I see plenty of them, and I'm very lucky to be able to see such amazing specimens, is they deny drinking a lot of alcohol when you specifically ask them that question. Yeah. Even after a very heavy race. That's what they tell me anyway.
Yeah, yeah, that's completely changed. That's yeah. Even in soccer players, yes. Which had a cradle of beer, but now they don't, per athlete. And now they drink not even one glass. Yes. Yeah, but the scars. You have scars or plaques. Did you see also, like you have seen, or the Heidbügel group has studies showing that you have fibrosis, scars, or what does they have?
Yes, no, I mean, and I think Aaron touched on some of the Heidbuchel work. Well, there are two types of scars.
Yeah.
There are what we call focal fibrosis. There is what we call minor fibrosis. This is fibrosis that affects the point where the right ventricle attaches the septum. Yeah. We see that in around 40% of our athletes, and we see that in 10% of our controls, and we don't think that's very specific. But the sort of scar I presented to you, the ischemic scar and the non-ischemic scar, we see that. We have noticed, if we do Holter monitors in athletes with ischemic scar, we see more ectopy and more runs of non-sustained ventricular tachycardia. So if we see ischemic scar, that's definitely not normal. But what we don't know the answer to is, what about this non-specific mid-wall scar? Does it represent a form of maybe an exercise-induced cardiomyopathy? Does it represent previous myocarditis? And why is it that some athletes get it and other athletes don't? There was a good study in triathletes, in about 83 triathletes, where they showed that the guys that got the scar were the guys that had the greatest left ventricular mass and had the highest blood pressure response. They were the ones that seemed to be getting the scar.
Yeah.
Again, I think what we need is, we've got so many, as you said, veteran athletes. The problem is that these tests, such as MRI scans and CT coronary angiograms, are so extortionately priced that to do any research project, you'd have to get a grant of multiple millions of pounds to do this properly. That's what you'd have to get.
And I would like that Aaron and Domenico respond to this question as well. So please, so I think it's we have now 3 experts here. And what do you think the interpretation? Focal scar, are there ischemic scars? Or the other question is, do we overlook in athletes myocarditis cases, which this is something which we see much more myocarditis cases than in previous times.
Yeah, so I mean, my take on this is that if you look at all of the studies that have quantified scar burden in athletes, every single one of them shares something in common, and that is that it is a significant minority of these athletes that have the scar. So to say that it is the athletics or the sport that causes this is, in my mind, illogical. Now, to say that the sports or the athletics superimposed with some other stimulus that affects a minority, maybe it's the blood pressure response, maybe it's occult infection, that makes sense, but I have to firmly believe that it's at least a 2-hit hypothesis.
We have more experience with young competitive athletes compared with veterans athletes, showed by Sanjay. So in young competitive athletes, the prevalence of post-ischemic scar is very low. So we have a junctional scar, that means scar, means late gadolinium enhancement. We are dealing with, of course, the myocardial fibrosis as evidenced by cardiac magnetic resonance. We have junctional scar that we have increasing evidence that are not pathologic, because probably reflect an increased pressure of pulmonary artery pressure that is part of the adaptive changes of the heart. Instead, we have non-ischemic scar, that means confined to the subepicardial layer or mid-mural left ventricular wall, and this non-ischemic scar in young competitive athletes, we demonstrate that are associated with increased morbidity and mortality in terms of arrhythmias and potentially sudden cardiac death. So in athletes, we don't know if there are previous myocarditis or segmental cardiomyopathies, but our results at the present time are that this non-ischemic scar may be accurately investigated in terms of their potential arrhythmogenesis, because they are increasingly found at post-mortem, for example, of young competitive athletes. In Italy, we had 2 recent sudden cardiac deaths in professional soccer player, and both had epicardial scar as the only cause of sudden cardiac death at post-mortem. So I think are very silent, clinically silent, because there are not associated symptoms, and can be demonstrated only by cardiac MRI, because echo usually misses this kind of scar, because they don't changes the contractility, the local contractility of the left ventricular wall, because they interest just the outer layer of the left ventricle. So I think in the future we should pay attention to this potential cause of arrhythmias and sudden cardiac death in young competitive athletes.
Can I just add one more thing? I think responsibly, when Sanjay studies coronary calcium or myocardial scars, all of us are trying to do, we have to be careful that we're, in addition to studying it and trying to understand the physiology, that we're not creating a problem where a problem doesn't exist. So what I mean by that is clinically, and I think you can attest to this, we don't see patients coming into the busy sports cardiology clinics we run in their 50s and 60s with unexplained malignant ventricular arrhythmias, which would be the pathology that SCAR would suggest. Nor do we see a lot of athletes with clinically relevant coronary disease, meaning blockages, myocardial infarctions, that don't have other risk factors in addition to their sport to explain it. So while these physiology studies are illustrative, they're interesting, they help us understand sport adaptation and maladaptation, when we transition those to the clinic, we need to be very careful not to be creating problems where problems don't exist.
Yeah, I'll have to agree. I didn't show the data, but when we monitor these athletes and controls, when we do 48-hour ECGs, we don't see an increase in ventricular ectopic burden or the morphology of the ventricular ectopics between veteran athletes and controls of the same age.
This is a good word to the very end. We were a little bit confused between and about our heart, but now we are relieved by these experts, and I think it was a very stimulating, interesting discussion. Thank you all for coming to Berlin, and thank you very much.
Yeah.
Hello, please sit down. We start. If you are so kind to close the doors, please. Thank you. Good. We can start. So, the development of ergometers and the mechanic applied to the rowing is making a very big steps, and these steps are really helping a lot. Thank you very much for closing the door. Thank you. I said these ergometers that are so important for us that they give the evaluation of athletes. We see the assessment of their training and their abilities. I think is a good step that we do today, that we will have construction, validity and reliability of measuring devices for wind-braked rowing ergometers, because we have a lot of products moving around. And I am sure that the next presenter, that is Leonard Meritz, is correct? Yeah. Sorry if I destroy your name. And I think he will give a very good explanation about these issues that I think is a big interest for mechanics or physicians. So we will have numbers to trust with. Okay. So I introduce Leonard, please.
Thank you. So my talk will be about the development of a measuring device for wind-braked ergometers. What are ergometers used for? Well, basically when we have weather conditions like this, it's a really good way for indoor training, but also the ergometers are used for competition, laboratory testing and team selection. And especially for laboratory testing and team selections, it's important that we know how valid and reliable the results are that our measuring device is producing. For the wind-braked ergometers, the C2 is arguably the most common used wind-braked ergometer, and the difference to, for example, a bike ergometer is that the power output is not externally adjustable, but is determined by the rower's stroke, force, distance, and frequency, which is due to the flywheel, which is here. And it's like this: the harder the pull is, the more resistance is created because a greater amount of air is circulated. And the C2 has a performance monitor which shows stroke by stroke the mechanical power, which is based on the angular velocity of the flywheel, which is measured. I will not go into detail on this formula, but what has been shown is that the formula or the power calculation of C2 is not equal to a power calculation using mechanical sensors measuring the force and the distance, and then calculating the work and in the end the power. So Lormes et al., they compared the power calculation of a C2 to the power measured with mechanical sensors, and they found that concept 2 produces mean values that are 6.8% lower. And Boyas et al. Did a similar study, and they found that the C2 underestimates the power roughly about 25 watts, and with increases with variations in intensity and pace. So both of these studies used human rowers as subjects, but those elite rowers, they do show a pretty high reliability, But in order to really quantify the power calculation of a C2 ergometer without any biological variation, for us there was a need for a measuring station or a test bench. So the aim was to produce or to build a test bench which is able to produce predefined artificial strokes with a high reproducibility and biomechanically valid force distance curves. I will go into this on the next slide. And in the end, to objectively assess the power calculation of a wind-braked ergometer. So this is what a force distance curve of an elite rower might look like, or looks like, because we measured it with a force sensor and a distance sensor. This is during the stroke motion, and the goal was for us to produce or to reproduce those force distance curves on our test bench on a rowing motion to just get valid results. So we partnered up with the Ulm University of Applied Sciences, which are experts in drive technology and engineering. And what came out was this test bench. We have it's basically made of aluminum strut profiles, and we have the ergometer, which is fixed within the test bench, and its handlebar is mounted on a sledge that moves on a linear drive and produces the rowing stroke. And the sledge and linear drive is powered by a 4.4 kilowatt servo motor, which is operated with the Siemens Sematic Step 7 software. And to get a reference power measurement, we measure the force and the distance with a force transducer and a rotary transducer. So the force transducer is located between the chain and the sledge, and the rotary transducer is at the flywheel. Both data go to a laptop, and we calculate stroke power, and the laptop also controls the rowing motion and feeds the input data. So during the developmental process, we faced a few challenges by producing these valid force distance curves. So at the start, we used distance time data we had from elite rowers to reproduce the rowing motion on our ergometer or on the test bench, with the assumption that because of the flywheel, the resulting force distance curve would look like the same, because basically the sledge moves the same distance as a rower during the motion. But as we can see right here, this was not the case. We had like a oscillation in the force distance curve, and it's in part due to the fact that our test bench has a really bigger stiffness than a human rower, because the body is able to store energy, and we accounted it by installing some springs to damp the motion. So what we got was this force distance curve, which is still not valid because the peak is at the end of the motion and not at the middle, like we wanted it to be. So this is probably due to the damping of the due to the springs, but also there's a difference because a rower is able to feel resistance of the flywheel. So at the start of the rowing motion, there's not a lot of resistance because the flywheel needs to be accelerated. And when the flywheel kind of grips, then the rower is able to produce a lot of force, which our sledge just cannot feel. It just does what it's told. So, but there's a near perfect correlation between the motor power and the motor torque. So we kind of changed from our time and distance input data to steering the sledge using torque curves to kind of have this motor power feedback. And this are the input curves we use to control the rowing motion. So here we can vary the peak of the torque and also the slope and the stroke structure. So another problem here was that a human rower is just able to produce high forces at certain joint angles, but our motor can probably produce high forces at any given point during the motion. So we had to install kind of this speed curve to limit the maximum speed of the sledge. And this curve is also from elite human rowers, so the sledge cannot go faster as a human rower. This is, okay, it's turned, but this is what it looked like. It's the sledge moving on the linear drive and producing rowing strokes. For the results, the first four curves are force distance curves of the elite rowers, and we can see that even between those there's a variation. The last two ones are ones we were able to produce with our test bench, so for me there's not much of a difference. As for the reproducibility, we did a measurement series of 10 measurements, with each containing 50 consecutive strokes, and we had a mean power output of 443 watts with a standard deviation of 2, and the mean power between the measurement series had a coefficient of variation of 0.53% and an ICC of 0.995, so I think it's pretty reproducible. If we go into one of those series, we can see the stroke-by-stroke variability being 0.75%. At the start, the first stroke is a little bit less powerful because the flywheel needs to be accelerated. It has a little bit higher standard deviation, but towards the end, it kind of stabilizes. If we go into one of these, this is the mean stroke over all series. And here we can also see that the standard deviation is pretty low. It gets a little bit bigger during the slope phases, but still I think it's pretty good. So I can conclude that we were able to simulate a human-like rowing stroke with a high reproducibility. And this brings me to the end, but just for me, because Mr. Gunnar Treff is going to continue on this subject. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Do you have any question? I have one question about this, how to put it, is a kind of, is an engine?
The motor?
Motor, yes, it's a motor. Why you put this? Is a kind of a reference for the power you put it, the rover is putting on their friction?
I don't really get the question.
Yeah, the question is this. Why we have the wind friction, and then
of the flywheel.
Yes, and then behind you put this motor.
Yes.
Why you put two of these to control through the computer that the power that you put is in reference of the power that we have on the engine?
Well, we have the motor to power the sledge that produces a rowing stroke. And while doing this, we have the power output measured by the C2, and also the mechanical power during the stroke we measure with the force sensor and the rotary transducer, which is which we want to test the difference between the C2 power calculation and our reference system. And the motor power is what powers our test bench.
I see. One is a reference.
Yes, one is the reference.
Another one is what really you produce on the. So you have a continuous control between the wheel and the control over the motor.
Yeah, and also I think you mean the input torque curve. So the input data, it's not exactly the same as the force distance curve we measure because of the flywheel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah.
Our next speaker is Gunnar Treff. It's my pleasure to introduce him. And you are talking today about the calculation, yeah, of the, so just...
the influence of stroke structure on,
here it is. So the influence
of
stroke characteristics on power calculation in windbreak rowing ergometer. So that's a continuation of the study you've been doing with Lennart together. Yeah. Thank you very much.
So thank you for the kind introduction. Well, once upon a time, in German rowing, the team trials on the Ergometer, the 2K tests, were performed on C2 ergs that were equipped with a modification that allows to measure force and distance to calculate in a physical manner the power output. We don't do this anymore for some years now, but I took a closer look at the data some years ago, and this was the motivation to build the measuring station, which was introduced by my colleague. And what we saw was something like this. You can see here, each ergometer is one ergometer, and each data point represents one average 2,000 meter output of one rower. And we see on the y-axis the difference between the reference system, which was attached or mounted to the C2 ergometer, and the ergometer output. And I think you can read this figure in two ways. Well, on the first, you would expect, if there's just a linear or systematic error, that the average of all these ergometers should be on the same level. So maybe here should be average, but we see obviously different mean values on each ergometer. And the other aspect, but you could say, well, maybe the ergometers are not the same or the reference system was not the same. But another issue which we cannot overlook is that there's a relevant scattering in the difference between the reference system and the Concept 2 ergometer on each of these measuring stations. And for your information, on each ergometer, nearly the whole amount, in all disciplines of rowers participated. So there were some men, some women, some lightweights, and scullers, some sweep rowers on each ergometer. This made me realize there might be a problem, and probably, I assume, that the reason for the difference within an ergometer but between rowers is due to the kind of rowing they perform. So maybe it's the stroke characteristics, or maybe it's the power output or the stroke frequency or something like this. We did some statistical analysis, and unfortunately we found nearly nothing. This explorative view didn't teach us a lot. So we built this measuring station, and this stays the same. And the first research question that I want to focus on in this talk is if the difference between the Concept 2 and the reference system is due to the stroke structure. We have other hypotheses too, but this is the one I would like to focus today. What we did is we used this mechanical rower, which Leonard presented in the previous talk, and we programmed two stroke structures, one with an early peak and one with a late peak, which you can see here. And the stroke frequency was 27 for both. We logged the C2 data with the float app. The mechanical power output was measured by the measuring station, by the bench. And we performed 10 series, each including 50 strokes of each structure. Statistically, we applied a mixed model approach which solves some problems quite easy for us. The results were as follows. Well, what you can see here in the first column is that early peak and late peak strokes, so the two stroke structures, led to a very similar power output on the reference system and also a quite similar power output on the Concept 2. And we do not see any statistical difference between these power outputs. So it was on average roughly 20% difference between those systems. And of course, this is nothing new. Boyas and Lormes reported already there's a significant difference between concept 2 and reference system. But, well, it doesn't matter a significant difference if it's systematic. When having a closer look to the data, things become interesting. We can see here the power output measured by or calculated by the concept 2, and on the green line the reference system, and we see obviously a huge difference in the first strokes, and then it's quite similar for the rest of the series. And with the late peak, it's a similar figure, but we obviously have some differences here in the start. What you can see here is the difference between the reference system and the concept 2 ergometer for the early peaking and late peaking stroke. And this seems to be a little bit different. If we have a closer look, we see there is a difference at the first 5 strokes. And the mixed model, so the statistical approach to calculate this phenomenon, showed us that we have significant effects for the stroke number, which means it is important if it's the first, second, 5th or 20th stroke, so there is a difference between strokes. And there's also a significant difference between stroke structures, that means early and late peaking stroke. And there's an interplay between stroke number and stroke structure. But normally every scientist says, wow, it's great, it's significant. But we have to look at effect sizes too. We see the effect size here in the last column. This laser sword is quite difficult for me. And what we can see here is that nearly all, more than 89% of this variance is explained by the stroke number and not by the stroke type or stroke structure. To make it more visual, we can see here the pairwise differences between strokes, which means that in the beginning, the first 5 strokes, we have significant or very high significant differences between early and late peaking strokes, but after from stroke 6 to 50, there's no difference. It's nearly the same. So the summary for this is that different stroke structures, like used here and programmed here, alter the difference in mechanical power output between 2 systems, but I don't think they are relevant, these differences, because mainly the difference is due to the influence of the first 5 strokes. And then our mechanical roller, who does nearly all the same with each stroke, does not produce significant differences. However, we don't know what happens when a rower is sitting on it, or what will happen when we teach our machine to row with a higher variability. We are quite happy about a low CV, but no rower in the world has such a low CV. So what happens when the rower has a higher variation in power output? So there's something to do for us, because this problem of the first slide is still there, and we didn't explain it with the first experiment. So we will evaluate more extreme structures. We will evaluate the influence of the drive to recovery ratio. Sorry for that typo. And we also want to examine the influence of a higher variation in power output. I would like to thank to a whole team that's supporting this nerdy project. It's the two Professor Engleder and Schulz from the Hochschule in Ulm. It's also the head of our partner, Jürgen Steinacker, who always supports us when we have crazy ideas like this. And also a big thank you to the Bundesinstitut für Sportwissenschaft, which gave us always a little bit of money to buy such nice stuff that Leonard presented before. So, thank you for your attention and thank you for listening.
Any questions? Ah, yeah. Charlie?
In the first few strokes, the Concept 2 monitor has to self-calibrate and it has to catch up. So some of the error is coming from those first few strokes. In the Boyas paper, they also show that novice rowers have much more error between the Concept 2 and reference measurement than elite rowers. So the next step that you're thinking about, to have the machine row with more human-like pace variation.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the bit that's really interesting. The bit that I'm trying to get my head around just now is if you have your machine row 5% above and below a mean average, does the Concept 2 error cancel out or does it not go away?
I agree. That's the next step to do, to test the higher variation. But the first issue was on the stroke structure, and the reason to look at the stroke structure is that I statistically analyzed a lot of data of real rowers and did not find any strong incident or evidence for an influence of a higher variability in power output or speed of the handlebar or anything like that. So I thought maybe it's the structure. That's the reason why we did this first.
Did you find a different drag factor?
Drag factor was always claimed.
Yeah, but you never try if with higher drag factor this effect is less or more?
No, up to now we claimed it all the time. But we will do this, and like Leonard Mans presented, it's possible with this machine because it's a closed system and it reacts limited like a rower does. A rower is also very limited regarding his power output and speed during the stroke.
So my name's Alex Dunn from Concept 2, just to declare that at the start. So particularly about the question about those first few strokes. If you go back to the early 90s when we had the PM1, that used to measure the forces as they were shown there, where we measured the input. Since the PM2, we switched to measuring the output. So at the start of a race, you would get very high forces, but you get very low boat speed. So what our monitor measures is effectively the boat speed rather than the force being input to the system. Hence the difference in those first few strokes where the machine is getting up to speed.
Yeah, thanks. I think this first strokes issue is extremely relevant when you do short tests. 20 seconds all out, 10 strokes max. I would not recommend to do that. Using only the Concept 2. That's all I can say. It's just the data say this and I translate it.
Any other question? Thanks, Gunnar.
Thank you.
The activity on the bike start to be more and more important in rowing, and I think this next presentation is quite interesting for us as a coaches to see if the mechanical work of our rowers is similar when they, for some problems or because they are tired of rowing, they use ergo bikes. So I am very curious to understand from Kirsty Turner what she can say about this point. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. So today I'm going to be talking about some research I helped complete whilst I was on placement with Rowing Australia in Canberra over summer. So we looked at comparing the physiological responses to identical power outputs on the Concept 2 row erg and Concept 2 bike erg. Bit of background. Rowers will regularly use cross-training in order to supplement the volume of training required to create local and central adaptations. And quite often, stationary cycling is one of the most common methods used to do so. Previous work by our group has shown marked differences in the physiological responses produced by the same rower on a Concept 2 row erg and watt bike at identical power outputs. And now that Concept 2 have brought out their own stationary cycle, we hypothesized that these two Concept 2 ergometers would produce more similar physiological responses than that of our previous study. Into the methods. So we recruited 10 male heavyweight and lightweight rowers for this study. The fastest heavyweight time was 6:06 and the slowest lightweight time was 6:50. Everybody else fitted in between somewhere. On a single day, they completed 2 submaximal incremental trials consisting of 4 by 6 minute workloads interspersed with 2-minute recovery periods. Workloads were equivalent to 50%, about 63%, 75%, and about 88% of their most recent 2,000 metre row erg PB wattage on a stationary Concept 2 ergometer, and these workloads were matched across modalities. Trials were separated by 45 minutes and diet was controlled prior to each trial. During each workload, we recorded stroke rate, cadence, and physiological variables. And during each recovery period, we recorded blood lactate concentration and rating of perceived exertion. So this diagram just shows the study timeline. So upon arrival, subjects were weighed, and based on this, they were fed 1 gram of carbohydrate per kilo body mass. They could have ingested this either via food or fluid, and upon the completion of this 15-minute period, they had a 30-minute wait before being reweighed and beginning test 1. The order of modalities was randomized, so they could have started on either the row erg or the bike erg. And upon the completion of test 1, they immediately started an active recovery on a watt bike to promote blood lactate reduction, whilst simultaneously beginning the 15-minute period to repeat their food and fluid ingestion from before trial 1. Upon completing this 15-minute period, there was a 30-minute wait before being reweighed and beginning the second test. So if they started on the row erg for test 1, then they were on the bike erg for test 2, and vice versa. Now we have a look at the test protocol. So prior to the beginning of each test, we recorded resting blood lactate. We see here we have workload 1, which was 50% of their most recent 2,000 metre row erg PB wattage, and the workload was 6 minutes long in order to ensure steady state blood lactate. After the workload period, there was immediately a recovery period of 2 minutes, during which we recorded blood lactate and rating of perceived exertion. During the workload, we recorded VO2, VCO2, RER, VE, and heart rate. So this was then repeated a further 3 times at increasing intensities. So from this, we could see the row erg produced significantly higher values than the bike erg for VO2, VCO2, VE, and heart rate across all 4 workloads. RPE was significantly higher for all workloads on the row erg, but this was not significantly different to those of the bike erg. The row erg blood lactate was similar for workloads 1 and 2, but was significantly higher for workloads 3 and 4 when compared with the bike erg. So the next few slides are just going to show these results through graphs. So here we have oxygen consumption on the y-axis and power output on the x-axis. The bike erg is represented by the orange line and the green line represents the row erg. The error bars are just indicating the differences across subjects, and throughout the following graphs, the power output will remain on the x-axis. And for the purposes of clarity, mean data will be displayed with significance being indicated by an asterisk. So here we can see the row erg produced significantly higher values than the bike erg across all 4 workloads. If we have a look at workload 4, we can see the row erg produced a value of 0.6 of a litre per minute more than the bike erg, despite the fact both monitors were displaying the same power output. Here we have heart rate on the y-axis, and we can see that once again, the row erg produced significantly higher values than the bike erg across all 4 workloads. Looking again at workload 4, we can see the row erg produced a value of 15 beats per minute, higher than the bike erg, despite both ergometer monitors displaying the same wattage. We move on now to have a look at blood lactate on the y-axis. We can see that for workloads 1 and 2, there really wasn't much difference between the row erg and the bike erg. But for workloads 3 and 4, the row erg increased significantly more than the bike erg. And looking again at workload 4, we can see the row erg produced a value of 3 millimoles per litre higher than the bike erg, despite the same wattage being displayed on the monitors. And finally, we have a look at RPE. We can see that whilst the row erg did produce higher values than the bike erg across all 4 workloads, none of these were statistically different. And looking at workload 4, we see the row erg produced an RPE value of 1 higher than the bike erg, the display monitors displaying the same power output. So what can we actually conclude from this? Well, despite being made by the same manufacturer, working at the same wattage on both the row erg and the bike erg does not produce the same metabolic load. In fact, the metabolic load is higher on the row erg, and as a result, there is an increased cardiovascular response, resulting in an increase in oxygen consumption. This data is very consistent to the work of our group previously, using a Concept 2 row erg and a watt bike, during which, when normalized for VO2, they found the row erg to be between 40 and 70 watts higher than the watt bike. And when normalized for VO2 in our investigation, we found the row erg to be between 60 and 70 watts harder than the bike erg. This leads us to believe that not all of the work being done on the row erg is actually being accounted for in the displayed power output. The power output is calculated by the spin down of the air brake during the drive phase. So during the recovery phase, as the rower is moving back into the catch position, this air brake is still spinning, and so the power is not actually being calculated at this time. Despite the fact the slide is on a decline, the rower must still activate their muscles in order to move back into the catch position, and as mentioned previously, the power output is not actually being calculated at this time. So this then helps to explain the higher metabolic and physiological load produced on the row erg, and therefore this then causes a substantial underestimation of power on the row erg. And thank you for listening.
There are questions? Yeah.
Hello, thank you for the presentation, really good one. I have a question about cadence or stroke rate. Did you record the cadence on the bike erg and the stroke rate on the ergometer? And that will be maybe one of the problems about the difference on the wattage regarding the physiology outputs, maybe?
We do have that data, just haven't included it here, so we'll probably have to go back and have a little look at it again to be able to answer that more clearly for you.
I'm sorry if I missed it. Did you show the VO2 maxes of the 2 comparative exercises?
No, so this was sub-maximal. So in the previous trial, using the watt bike and the Concept 2 row erg, it was a maximal, including like VO2 max, but ours was sub-maximal, so no, we don't.
So you expressed the workload as a percent of their VO2 max?
We used their most recent 2,000 meter row erg PB to decide what the workloads were going to be.
Because the question was going to be whether the VO2 maxes were the same on the 2 modes of exercise, but you won't have that.
Well, in the previous study, using the Concept 2 row erg and the watt bike, they were.
Do you recall if they were pretty much the same, or was there a higher VO2 max on the rowing or cycling? Do you recall at all?
In our study?
Yes.
The VO2 was higher. In step 4, like I have workload 4 for the...
Sorry, I meant at the VO2 max. So
oh, no, we don't have VO2 max data for this study. So.
Okay, thank you.
More questions? Thank you very much, Chris.
Okay, our last presentation for the session will be presented by Manuela Boyne, and I look forward to listen to your talk about optimization of the, could we just bring that title up, please? It's hard to see. Optimization of the geometry of the rowing seat using FE simulation and in 3D print. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. I'm happy to be here with you and to present this project which was done together with my colleagues Gottfried Göbel, Helmut Hoffmann and Susanne Hummel. And what I would like to show you today is, first of all, of course, motivation. Why did we do this? Then simulation method and model setup, some simulation results. And then we are going from simulation to the practical side. We have done imprints and we have done 3D printing of optimized seat. I would like to show you final results and discuss future tasks and open questions. Okay, motivation. We have done a short, very preliminary questionnaire just to get an idea on how big this problem is in the Ulmer Ruder Club Donau e.V. We had 29 participants, both male and female. We had all ages from kids up to seniors, and we have asked them with a questionnaire about health problems after longer-term rowing. And interestingly, 69% of these rowers said, yes, we have problems, either often or rarely. Often was the most ticked box. Characterization of these problems, here you can see the German explanation, but you might not be able to read it. In English, it's pins and needles, burning, and numbness of legs and numbness in the buttocks. And as you can see here, majority of the ticks were in the area of numbness. And this brought us to the investigation of the seat comfort, because this is correlated with the seat. And if we look into seat comfort, this is a technique usually done in automotive industry where I'm coming from. I'm not from rowing, but we have used this technique. We wanted to implement this technique into for this project, and it's done in the area of office seat design. Okay, so what is seat comfort talking about? We have comfort and we have discomfort, but these are not on one line. You can't have more comfort and a bit less discomfort. It's an opposite direction. If you have discomfort, you don't have comfort at all anymore. Because if you have pain or numbness, these are the main drivers for discomfort, then you don't feel comfortable anymore. Comfortable is relaxed, well-being. This is what is correlated with comfort. This has been shown by Zhang et al. Discomfort can be evaluated by pressure distributions. This has been shown by different papers already, and the distribution should be as smooth and as uniform as possible. And we need a low maximum pressure for this to get a smooth distribution at a low gradient. And why did we do a simulation study? Because this can be simulated. You need a human body model, which is representing the buttocks, the bones, etc. correctly, and then you can analyze parameters like the pressure distribution. You can look into different things. You can, for instance, look into final seating. This has been done also by different papers in the area of automotive and furniture already, but never in the area of rowing. And what have we done? We have, yes, you can run the model. We have used this human body model. This is the TAMS. This is a commercially available human body model developed by Toyota for the automotive industry. I'm coming from the occupant simulation. So we are trying to keep occupants in a crash healthy. And this model is taken from this. The environment, yes, you can see here for the feet. These were fixed planes, fixed at the edges only. And in the first step, we just placed the steel plane below our model to test, can we do it, can't we do it? This was the first test. And as you have seen, we get this sitting. Final, in later tests, we have done rowing seats. I will show you. We have loaded the whole model by gravity, included a surface-to-surface contact with friction, this is important, and we analyzed the pressure interface and the pressurized area. As you could see, the model was still sitting down because there are no muscles activated. And therefore, if you run it longer than these 200 milliseconds was what we have done, your model will sync together. But as you can see here, after about 80 milliseconds, you get no movement in the area of the contact anymore. So at that time, we analyzed the pressure. And the pressure distribution, you can see here. This is the pressure at the buttock. And yes, please one. Please also click at this one, because they should run together. Okay, so you see the pressure distribution here, and this is the pressure at the time of the maximum. You see a very local pressurization here. Of course, you're sitting on a steel plate, and the maximum pressure is quite high. Then but it is functioning. It gave us good results. Then we placed the rowing seat below our model. Only the geometry was changed, nothing else. Everything else was kept the same. And what did we get? We got these distributions of the pressure. You see a very localized pressure, and it's even more prominent if we increase the scaling here. And you see directly at the edges of the seat, you have the high pressure level. And the maximum pressure at this rowing seat was even higher than at the steel seat, just at the steel plate. So it's more, there's higher discomfort on this rowing seat than if you would sit on a steel seat. What did we? We analyzed 2 more seats, but I don't go into this because of timing. We had another rowing seat which showed very similar results, and we had an ergometer seat. I will show you in the overview, but not in detail. What I would like to show you in detail is how we wanted to optimize the seat. Yes, please click at the model. Okay, then click here as well. Okay, this is the foam block. This is a deformable foam, and we let our model sit again, and you see you get this deformation. You get a very smooth compression of this foam, and the pressure distribution which we get at the human body model, at the buttock, and at the foam are very smooth now. It looks more wet here, but it's a completely different scale. It's an individual scale. The pressure is very much reduced. We have a large pressurized area and a very smooth distribution. Then we use this surface of this foam and placed it as seat below our human body model. Yes, please let the model run. You can see how it sits down. And these are the pressurized, the pressure results. Pressurized area is very big. And if we compare all of the different models which we have run, and we set the rowing seat to 100% maximum interface pressure, we see the steel plate was lower, the other 2 were in the area of the steel plate, and we see here the optimized seat has a reduction of 60%. This is an overview of all of these different pressure distributions with the fixed scale, with all of the same scale. Here you see the steel plate. This is the rowing seat which I have shown you. This is a different rowing seat. This is the ergometer seat. This is the foam, and this is the optimized seat. And what I also can show is the surface of the human body model which is in contact with the seat. And here you see the steel, in the steel seat, you see really the bones showing up there. Here in the 2 rowing seats, here even more, you see the holes of the seat and you see the edges of the seat. This is the ergometer seat, and here this is the foam and the optimized seat. Here you have a very smooth area, very large contact area, which reduces your pressure. So what could we conclude from this part of the study? We could reduce the pressure by 60%, the pressurized area could be very much increased, and we could define an optimized geometry for this specific rower, because this is TAMS, this is one specific human. It's not general. But we wanted to apply this to other people, and therefore we defined design rules from this analysis. What should we do if we want to optimize a rowing seat? We need to maximize the available pressurized surface. This means avoid these holes. We need to adapt the surface to the deformed buttocks of the special rower, and we need to move the edges a bit out of the pressurized area. And how did we do this for specific people? Because we had our rowers in the club, but we don't have models for them. So what we did is imprints. How did we do these? We used kinetic sand. We did two configurations, one with a fixed seat on the ergometer. We asked them just to take a comfortable seating position, sit down and sit still. And the second one you can see here at the side, we asked them to do complete rowing cycles. And from these, we took these imprints, we scanned them with a 3D scanner, and my colleague reverse engineered these imprints by the freeform modeler iChemSurf. They cutted it, they got all of these points of the surface, and he modeled the surface and added this surface to a standard rowing seat, to the base of this rowing seat. And then we printed these seats. And these are the results for two specific rowers. You already can see here the differences. And the final testing was done. Yes, I have to say, basically it was the starting point of this project, because this test was planned before we did the project. They wanted to do a rowing tour from Ulm down to the Black Sea on the River Danube. And they asked us to improve their seats, because they said, if we do this with a standard seat, we will have so much pain, we cannot do it. And final result, nearly 2,600 kilometers, 79 days, they crossed and touched 10 countries, 5 hours rowing every day, and no pain. So this is their subjective feedback, of course. So what could we show? We could show the feasibility of the applied method, at least for these two rowers. We have reduced the interface pressure by 60%. We have modeled two seats for these specific rowers, and they confirmed the improvement. But there are still a lot of open items. For instance, the build of the person. How strongly does the geometry of our optimized seat depend on the person? Do we need a specific seat for every person, or are some group of seats necessary? This is something we would like to investigate. The next point is, how much does the difference between static seating and complete rowing cycle influence this geometry? Enhancement of the imprinting, the material and the equipment is in focus, and optimization of the process from imprint to scan to 3D print. And finally, this was a tour, this was a tournament rowing, but question is, what about athletes? Would it help them as well or not? And they don't do these long tours, but they do long trainings. Even if the tours which they do in competition are very short, but the trainings are very long. So this is also an open item. And if you are interested in this, thank you very much for your attention. We are very open. We would like to welcome you, if you are interested in this, to work together with us and to start a small project on this. Thank you very much again.
Do we have any questions?
I have a question for you.
how much it costs one seat now? Maybe later less, but now.
We did not calculate the costs so far. This was just a research project within the University of Applied Sciences in Ulm, and these are first two prototypes. So usually prototypes are golden. We did not calculate it, but if we would do it in standard, then we would have to justify this. But as I said, right now, everything is done really intensively. And we would need to get smoother processes from the imprint through the 3D surface to the 3D print, automate it, and then it would be much easier. But this would be something of interest. This is where we would like to work on.
I ask the cost because I listen to the interior minister that he give 5 million for research. So maybe 1 or 2 are for you for the seats. No, beside jokes. Yeah. I think the women, they have a lot of problems with the seat. I think mostly in all countries, maybe because the pelvis is a little bit different, wider than men, and maybe the seats are painted for men. But it's one big issue. So I am really interested in your research that I think is important.
The problems reported were not only women. There were more for women. About 75% of the women reported problems, but also, if I remember it correctly, about 60% of the men. So it was distributed. More women, yes, but also men.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we close. I think this session is finished. And what do we have else? What else do we have? Yes, there is the workshop with the seeding. All coaches, they are interested for seeding, how we make the seeding before international regattas, World Cup, World Championship. You can go in the room. Which one it is? Warsaw room. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.